Soulmate Story Collection. How it works. This collection is run entirely on prompts from my readers. I do not choose the pairings myself. When prompts open, I allow a 12-hour window for anyone interested to throw their idea into the pot. After the 12 hours are up, I use a random number generator to select 10 different prompts to fill. After I have filled all 10 prompts, I open another round. Rinse and repeat. Check the end notes of the most recent chapter to see how many chapters are left in the current round. Embark on a thrilling and mysterious adventure with Soulmate Story Collection. Engulfing readers in a world intertwined between the present and the past, the story delves into uncovering long-hidden secrets. Why does the past continue to haunt the present? Can the main character safely unravel the truth behind the shattered fragments of memory? With each chapter, readers will be drawn into a world full of mystery and intrigue. Written by a talented author, Soulmate Story Collection promises to provide you with hours of emotionally charged entertainment. Prepare yourself for a journey full of peril and discovery, where all truths are laid bare and mysteries unraveled. Don't miss the opportunity to explore Soulmate Story Collection today. Chapter 1, Kakashi Sakura, the one where your eyes change color. Chapter text. When they made eye contact for the first time, Kakashi had watched her left eye slowly change from gray to green so that it matched the fresh spring color of her right eye. As many had said, it must have had no sensation, seeing as she hadn't reacted at all. Kakashi said nothing about it, only passed the girl and kept walking down the street without speaking to her as he had intended to. He had wanted to meet his new students before they knew who he was. He hadn't wanted to know that one of them was his soulmate. She was 12 years old to his 26, and he felt a little like a dirty old man. It was true that not all soulmate relationships were romantic ones, but he still felt there wasn't a proper word for it. He felt like he might date her. When he met her officially the next day as the sensei of Team 7, the halls had still been buzzing with the news that Haruno Sakura had found her soulmate but didn't know who it was. Her situation was almost unheard of. How could she not know when she should have seen her soulmate's eye change color as well? Sakura could not even remember when exactly the change had happened, much to her worry. Kakashi said nothing when they met. They had passed each other on the street as strangers. She had barely given him a glance, had not even seemed to take note of him as more than a fellow shinobi of Konoha, and when she said nothing as well, he concluded that the incident hadn't stuck in her mind. He was glad. He was determined to keep it that way. She was 12 and full of innocence, and he planned on keeping her as far away from his jaded darkness as possible. Years passed and Kakashi lost his 3 students. One betrayed them, one left them, and Kakashi hid himself away from the budding flower that haunted his sweetest dreams. Many would say that he was neglectful of the only girl on his team. He would admit that they were right. What he would not admit was how she terrified him. How he woke in the night trembling for nightmares and wanting nothing more than to feel her warm chakra nearby. Or hear her voice cheerfully going on about all the silly little things that young people consider important. He would never admit how much he had started to rely on a girl that he tried so hard to ignore. He didn't want Sakura to know him. He didn't want his shadows to reach out and wrap around her pale, soft fingers or darken her bright green eyes. He didn't see her for 2 years, but when he did, she had changed in ways he could not have imagined. Gone was the softness and the innocence. In their place was strength and fire. At 16 years old, Sakura was well on her way to becoming a beautiful woman who would rock the foundation of the shinobi world. Kakashi found himself pulled back and staying by her side, if only to bask in the light she shined upon the world. Even if she didn't mean to be, even if she didn't realize it then, she became the rock that Kakashi clung to. War waged and waned, and Konoha prospered in the peace that came after. Years passed and Kakashi watched her fulfill all the promises of her childhood by growing into the type of women all little girls aspire to be. She was beauty and grace, strength and spirit, intelligence and warmth. Yet through it all, the smallest shadow of sadness remained in her. For Sakura had 2 green eyes and no soulmate in sight. Naruto had gained his second blue eye the day that Hinata had finally looked at him dead on. Watching their eyes correct themselves had the girl fainting from pure shock or pure happiness. No one could tell. Many of their childhood friends had found their soulmates during the war childhood. Kakashi watched Sakura as she longed to know where her other half was and did nothing. After so long, what was he supposed to say? Even if, as the years went by, his feelings of friendship blossomed into something deeper, he still couldn't find it in himself to admit the truth. In the end, the decision was taken out of his hands. Being named Hokage came with a lot of perks and a lot of downsides. Some would consider being allowed to live in the Hokage manor a perk. Kakashi had always thought of it as a downside. His apartment was lonely enough. What would he do with all that extra empty space in an entire manor? It had taken them 4 years, but finally the council and his own former students had bullied him into making the move. Sakura and Naruto even showed up to help him move just to make sure he actually did it, of course. They didn't seem to trust that he would do it on his own. It wasn't the first time the two had been inside his dingy apartment, but it was the first time they had been inside longer than it took to drag him off his couch and out for some horrid bout of socialization. They were understandably curious, poking their noses into every crevice and corner, trying to dredge up a little bit of gossip about the ever-mysterious Hatake Kakashi. Naruto eyeballed every book that he pulled off the bookcase, packing them each in a box at his feet and scowling at how boring they all were. Kakashi felt no need to tell the boy that half of those book covers were fake and actually contained sappy romance novels instead of jutsu manuals. Sakura, on the other hand, had gone straight for his bedroom, claiming she would help him fold clothes. He figured if she wanted to fold his boring, completely embarrassing underwear, then she was welcome to less work for him. He entirely forgot what other damning items his bedroom contained. When the pink-haired young woman came out of the bedroom with what looked like a picture frame in hand, he still didn't make the connection. He only raised an eyebrow while his hands continued to pull barely used dishes from his cupboards. She held the frame up, showing the only picture he had of Team Minado, his own Genentane. "Your left eye." It was green. Her voice was shaken and quiet. Kakashi's hands carefully set the plate he held in the box, then went still. He fought the urge to touch the scar that ran down one side of his face. She was right, of course. His left eye had been green right up until the day when an enemy had put a blade straight through the socket and the mangled organ had been replaced with a lost friend Sharingan. And when Naruto had rebuilt his eye during the war, it had grown back, matching his other. No one had questioned it until today, something he was rather surprised about. He'd never mentioned to a single soul that he knew who his soulmate was, not in all the years between then and now. "I remembered you," Sakura declared. Behind her, Naruto looked back and forth between them with confusion. "I remembered seeing you the day before we met our new sensei." Her looked you right in the eye. "And when I got home I had 2 green eyes instead of green and gray." "You have 2 gray eyes, Kakashi." But she used to have a green left eye. With no small amount of force, the picture frame was thrown at his chest. Kakashi turned and caught it reflexively. This was the only picture he had of these 3 precious people, after all, and even in his current deer-in-headlights panicked state, his hands moved to save such an invaluable item. "What are you talking about, Sakura-chan?" Naruto came closer, abandoning the bookshelf. Sakura narrowed her eyes at her silver-haired Hokage as she answered. "Don't you remember Naruto?" she asked. "My left eye was gray back when we were in the academy. Then one day it wasn't. The day before we became Team 7, I got my second green eye." Comprehension dawned on Naruto's face and he nodded. "Millimeter. Millimeter. I remember now. I never knew when it happened. But I know I saw you that day, Kakashi. And no one remembers what color your left eye was before you lost it. I never made the connection. I never thought to ask. Did you?" Sakura trailed off, unsure how to word what she wanted to say. Kakashi understood anyway. She was asking if he had made the connection, if he could offer her the missing piece of herself that she had been searching for all these years. Kakashi's fingers tightened on the frame in his hands, then set it down on the counter behind himself. He drew a slow breath in, fighting against the tightness in his chest, and let it back out slowly. "Naruto, could you give us a moment alone?" he requested. The blonde pointed an accusing finger at him. "Are you really her soulmate, Kaka-sensei?" he demanded. Kakashi scowled. "Whether I am or not is none of your business." His own finger pointed at the door. "I'd appreciate some privacy for this conversation." "Go." Naruto narrowed his eyes and grumbled under his breath. It took insisting a few more times, but eventually he did leave. His glare never faded. He seemed to be daring the older man to even think of hurting their teammate and promising pain in the case that he did. When they were finally alone, Kakashi let his gaze drift back to the woman a few feet away from him. Sakura's hands were clenched into fists and her jaw was set. He could almost hear the mental pep talk she was surely giving herself, getting ready to take any kind of news. Another deep breath did absolutely nothing to calm his nerves, but he went ahead and started talking anyway. "You did see me that day. I remember it too. I remember looking into the eyes of a little girl and watching one of them fade from gray to green. I remember thinking, that's impossible. And you just walked on by without saying a thing. And I let you." He couldn't make himself meet her gaze. He focused on her bare feet, watching her toes curl against the linoleum. "Then it's true," he heard her whisper. "You're really my soulmate." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. No words seemed adequate. He settled for nodding and rubbing the back of his neck, bracing himself for the storm that was about to crash into him. He was incredibly shocked when the crash came in a form he had never considered. Instinctually, he groaned at the press of warm lips against his own, wonderful even through the mask. His arms automatically came up to wrap around Sakura's waist, pulling her closer and holding her tightly to his chest. She pressed her lips more firmly against his for a brief moment before slowly pulling away to leave them both panting a bit. Kakashi swallowed thickly and made a garbled noise of protest, wanting her to come back. He had a few seconds to bask in the moment before, just as suddenly as the kiss, a fist planted itself in his gut. "You idiot!" There it was. "You absolute moron!" That's what he thought her first reaction would have been. "How could you keep this from me?" Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. Kakashi whimpered, half out of pain and half out of a very sensible fear of her strength and what she might do with it next. "You were 12, he mumbled. "I was 26. It felt wrong." Sakura eyed him, fist still clenched. "All right," she ground out between her teeth. "I'll give you that. But what about after? It's been years, Kakashi. I've already been an adult for years. And still you said nothing. Why?" In the face of her demands, his mind went blank and he blurted out the only thing he could think of, the truth. I honestly thought you'd be better off without me, you know." Sakura gaped at him and his eyes drifted slightly to the side in shame. "I wanted you to find happiness." He waited in silence for the yelling to start again. When a fist thumped down on the top of his head, he was surprised by how comparatively gentle it was. "Better off without my soulmate. Better off without my perfect other half." Sakura sounded more resigned than angry now. "Kakashi, you are the stupidest, most idiotic, empty-headed, thoughtless, dim-witted bonehead that I have ever met." "Probably," he sighed miserably. A finger lifted his chin, forcing his eyes to meet hers again. "And I fell in love with you when I was 19, she finished softly. It was Kakashi's turn to gape. "You didn't even know we were soulmates." She smiled and said, "No, I didn't. But I loved you anyway." With that, she kissed him once more. Unable to come up with any sort of protest, Kakashi kissed her back, holding her even tighter than before. He had spent years trying to protect her without realizing the one fact that should have been most obvious. Haruno Sakura needed no one's protection. Chapter 2, Madara Tobirama, the one where the first touch leaves a mark. Strangely, what surprised him the most was that it took them this long to discover it. They had known each other since that day by the riverside Lomigure, when Hashirama and Madara's budding friendship had come to a halt on the order of their fathers. They had crossed each other in battle countless times, although usually they had battled each other's sibling. For God's sake, they had both helped to build a village and run it for years side by side with Hashirama. And only now did they actually touch for the first time. Only now did they discover that they were soulmates. Tobirama inspected the handprint on his bicep that had not been there a moment ago. The mark of where his soulmate first touched him would never fade. It would decorate his skin for the rest of his life, marking him as one who had found that perfect complement. He was fascinated to see that the fingertips, if one looked closely enough, even included the whorls and lines of Madara's fingerprints. He was also pleased by the rich red color. It matched the markings on his face. When he looked over, Madara was staring at the freshly blossomed mark as well, with shock in his expression. They had been training together another first. Usually Tobirama trained with his brother or his cousin Tuka. The sleeveless top he wore for training bared more skin than he had probably ever shown to Uchiha Madara before. When he thought about it, it made sense. They didn't have much interaction outside of work, where he typically wore formal robes or battle armor, depending on the day's duties. When Madara had grabbed his arm in an attempt to start their spar by throwing him, it had felt like a lightning bolt went straight through him. "Is that what I think it is?" Madara's voice came out slightly high-pitched, making the corners of Tobirama's mouth twitch up. "A soul mark, yes," he agreed. The older man's eye twitched. "That seems unlikely." When Tobirama did nothing more than smirk harder and raise an eyebrow, Madara scowled. "We've been at peace for years. How could we never have touched?" Tobirama shrugged and pointed out, "We both wear gloves, usually. And neither of us are inclined towards public nudity, so there weren't a lot of chances, I suppose." He took pleasure in Madara's spluttering and the red spreading across those aristocratic cheekbones. His companion harumphed moodily. "Well, it still seems unlikely," he insisted. "Did you feel anything?" "I didn't feel anything." With a roll of his eyes, Tobirama reached out and grasped Madara's shirt. In playing the speed he was famous for, he barely gave Madara time to squeak before he had lifted the shirt and pressed his palm to the other man's chest, directly over his heart. It was gratifying to watch him twitch as, presumably, the same lightning sensation frazzled along his nerves. When he pulled his palm away, an imprint of his hand remained, this one colored in blue. Madara stared at the mark, his mouth working with no words coming out. His gaze shifted from Tobirama to the soul mark and back again several times before he lifted his own hand to trace it gently, almost reverently. Then he swallowed thickly. "I see," he murmured quietly. Finally his eyes held Tobirama's own. "Soulmates, eh?" "So it would seem." Tobirama crossed his arms and waited. Madara was an unpredictable sort of person, and he was still a bit wary of a negative reaction. Surprisingly, the man only nodded his head slowly. "Well," he said a bit distantly. "At least the clan elders won't be bothering me about Ez anymore. I can't see you carrying any children for me." After a beat of surprise, Tobirama burst out laughing. Madara later told him that it was the first time he had heard him laugh. It was also the moment that he fell in love. Chapter 3, Kakashi Tenzo, the one where your mark represents your soulmate. Kakashi lay on his stomach, limbs sprawled at whatever angle they happened to land in when he had flopped down a half-hour ago. His muscles were slowly melting into the mattress until he was sure that he'd never be able to move again. In all the years he'd spent on the battlefield, he had never dreamed he'd be able to feel so content, so happy. Fingers traced patterns on his back that he could not see but knew what they were without thinking. A gentle smile touched his lips and he sighed without opening his eyes. A pair of lips pressed a kiss to his mid-back in response. "If you get any more relaxed, you'll turn into a puddle," Tenzo's voice drifted overhead. "Ma, I apologize for nothing," he murmured back. Tenzo chuckled. "I never said it was a bad thing. You deserve a little relaxation." The younger man's fingers never ceased their exploration, following along the lines of the tattoo that had brought them together. Kakashi's soul mark was larger than most people's. The great apple tree stretched from his lower back almost to the tips of his shoulders, and the branches almost wrapped around both his sides. The first time they had kissed, luscious red fruit had appeared in amongst the leaves. As apple trees were often used to represent love and generosity, Kakashi often wondered how he didn't realize that his mark was meant for Tenzo until only a few years ago. With a hum he turned his head and made a soft noise. He was rewarded with another kiss, this one against his exposed cheek. He dropped his face back into the pillow and let his smile widen. Even before they had realized they were paired, the two men had known each other better than anyone else. Tenzo could read his wishes in the smallest movements and sounds. Knew what he was feeling even when he wore a mask to hide his face. When Tenzo sat back to where he had been, straddled across the backs of Kakashi's thighs, his fingers resumed tracing the branches of the apple tree before him. Kakashi could feel the muscles twitching minutely in the legs that bracketed his own, and he knew that Tenzo's mark would be pressed up against his skin in this position. The white wolf with a lightning bolt caught between its teeth would be running towards the top of his calf. He promised himself that he would trace the mark with his tongue later. Much later. when he felt like moving. Right now he was content to stay where he was. Chapter 4, Madara Kakashi, the one where your soulmate must say your name. There was a saying which proclaimed that one should never meet their heroes. Kakashi reflected that this was true. Traveling back in time had been an incredible experience, and meeting titans of the shinobi world such as Hashirama and Madara had been awe-inspiring at first. Then he had gotten to know them. Boy, had he ever been disillusioned after that. Hashirama he met first. The older man had found him only hours after his time jump, dazedly wandering through the forest near the Shinja compound. He and his brother were the only two people who knew his true origins, and they had adopted him as a Shinju almost immediately after hearing his story. It was nice to have brothers after more than a decade of no family at all. However, as he had mentioned, one should never get to know one's heroes. Hashirama was almost as obnoxiously cheerful as Guy, with the same propensity towards spontaneous tears and a disturbing habit of becoming theatrically depressed at the slightest provocation. It took a lot of energy to spend large amounts of time around him, although Kakashi was used to it somewhat from overexposure to Guy. Tobirama he got along with a lot better. They shared a level of intellect and a love of quiet spaces filled with books. That didn't mean that Tobirama was without his strange quirks which Kakashi could have gone without. His new silver-haired brother often got entirely too into his research and didn't like taking no for an answer when he wanted a volunteer to test something out on. One memorable incident had left Kakashi with a cat's tail for a week. It was an experience he was not in a hurry to repeat. After that he had learned to steer clear whenever the inventing gleam showed up in Tobirama's ruby eyes. Madara, however, was the one that he was most unprepared for. When he thought about Uchiha Madara, the first image his brain used to come up with had usually been a typical Uchiha face in the midst of manic, evil laughter. The reality was a man who tried very hard to cover his innate dorkiness by always being grumpy. It worked on most people who were absolutely terrified of him. It did not work on Kakashi. Kakashi was the master of seeing underneath the underneath. And underneath Madara's ever-present temper tantrum was the beating heart of a giant dork. The man was a sucker for small children. You'd never know it, as most were too frightened by his appearance to approach him, but Uchiha Madara would be the first one to sit down and let a child braid his hair with flowers. In fact, Kakashi had once caught him in the middle of just that, and the teasing still hadn't stopped. He was also a closet bookworm. Tobirama was infamous for his love of learning and research, but Madara was the one with a bookshelf full of novels that he read in bed every night and would go on about the plot lines for, given half the chance. The first time Kakashi had whipped out his book in front of Madara, the older man had actually derailed his yelling in favor of trying to see what he was reading. When he'd finally caught wind that it was a filthy, horrendous deviancy, it had become his mission to try to steer Kakashi towards so-called better reading material. They were usually adventure novels because, well, nerd. His dorkiness was obvious in the way he doodled on every copy of every report that was not actually going to be filed, the way he wore hair in front of one side of his face because it wasn't his good side, and the fact that Kakashi had once surprised him at home and seen him wearing pajama pants with little cartoon dots on them. No matter how much the man had insisted they were a present from Hashirama, the fact remained that he had kept them and worn them. Disillusioned as he was, Kakashi found it really hard to be afraid of a man who made an ick face every time someone put pickles on his sandwich. Which meant that he was free to tease him. It quickly became his favorite pastime to tease Madara at every opportunity that presented itself. Which is how he came to be doing what he was, fleeing from a riled-up, flustered dork whose hair was standing on end from all the shouting he was doing. Kakashi laughed as he sprinted up the side of the Hokage Tower and flung himself through the window for the office of their newly elected village leader. Expecting Hashirama, he instead found Tobirama at the desk, who looked startled and confused when Kakashi threw himself down, dragging the man's chair backwards to barricade himself in the corner. Confusion turned to exasperation when Madara stormed in through the same window a moment later. "Kakashi, what have you done to him this time?" The suffering was obvious in Tobirama's voice. Still, he didn't get up from the chair to leave his little brother to Madara's clutches. The silver-haired man in the corner chortled. "All I did was offer him more peanuts," he protested as innocently as he could. Madara clenched his fists and bellowed, "You were throwing them at my head." The angelic face Kakashi tried to make was mostly wasted behind the mask he wore. Tobirama heaved a sigh and rubbed at his temple. Dealing with the antics of these two was never easy, and somehow it usually fell to him to break them apart. Wondering why Hashirama had ever insisted that they get to know each other better, the second Senju brother eyed Madara with a look that dared him to move from that spot and then rolled his chair away from the corner. "Kakashi, if you love me as a brother like you say you do, then you will do me a favor. You will leave Madara alone." A strategic flare of the chakra that was feared by any who faced him in battle had the younger man bolting out of the corner and sidling up next to Madara, pressing against him in an ostentatious display of good behavior. "Ma, leave him alone." "How could I leave my favorite Uchiha dash?" "Kakashi, I'll stop bothering him." Kakashi yelped when that oppressive chakra flared again. He wasn't hailed as a genius for nothing. He knew when to cut his losses. Madara raised an eyebrow at the man still plastered to his side, although more for protection than humor now. It boggled his mind how different all three of the Senju brothers were. There was very little in common between any of their personalities. Not nothing, of course, but little. He shook his head in wonder. "How is that you are related to this buffoon?" he asked absent-mindedly. He really wasn't expecting the response. "He's adopted," the Senju growled. Madara paused, both eyebrows shooting up for his hairline. "You're not serious?" he asked, looking between them. Kakashi shrugged and stepped away, with his hands immediately seeking his pockets as Tobirama said mildly, trying to cover his angry misspeak, "I thought you knew that, Madara." The head of the Uchiha clan shook his head in bewilderment, looking to Kakashi for clarification. The younger man's visible eye turned up in his signature smile. "Yup. I was born in the Hate clan, actually." He shrugged again, as if this wasn't mind-bending news. It explained absolutely everything about the difference between brothers. It explained the man's obsession with dogs. It even explained his fanatical loyalty to anyone he saw as a part of his pack, as so to say. "Well, Obi," he murmured under his breath. "Well, if that's all wrapped up, I'll just be going then." Hoping for a quick getaway, Kakashi strolled casually for the door. He had managed to make it into the hallway when Madara caught up to him, glaring as if offended that he'd left without him. They walked together in silence, weaving their way throughout the tower. Kakashi let his companion chew over this new information in pace. It wasn't all that surprising that he hadn't guessed. Kakashi's hair color matched Tobirama's closely enough that most people swallowed the fiction whole without bothering to wonder why no one had ever heard of the third Senju brother until just a few years ago. He wondered if, after how close they had all become, Madara might be offended that he'd never been told this secret. He wondered how Madara would react to finding out the big secret, that he wasn't actually supposed to exist in this time. Nothing was said as they stepped out onto the public streets and, without discussion, headed towards the Uchiha compound. They passed the academy still in construction, skirted the park with children playing, and avoided the marketplace with vendors hollering out their wares. It wasn't until they were cutting through an empty training field that Madara hummed to himself. "Hate Kakashi," he murmured, trying the name out loud. Kakashi stopped dead in his tracks. Something deep inside him was singing, calling out in rapturous joy the likes of which he'd never experienced before. It felt like lightning dancing inside him, like fire running through his veins, like floating on air. It felt like every cliché in every romance he'd ever read. Madara stopped and looked back at him inquiringly. Kakashi did the only thing he could think of. He retaliated in kind. "Uchiha Madara," he mumbled, watching Madara stiffen as his eyes blew wide in shock. How often does one call someone by their full name? Not often. Kakashi figured it was reasonable that Madara had never happened to be present when Kakashi used his full title. Still, it was a bit jarring to discover that the man you had been teasing for the past few years was actually your soulmate. As the sensations in his body slowly faded away, Kakashi became aware of the faintest pulling sensation in his chest, like something had a hook in him and was reeling him in very gently. It was pulling him towards Madara. As the older man seemed to slowly recover from his own shocking experience, Kakashi caught his eye. "I was not expecting that," he admitted. Madara, to his amusement, blushed. "I was hoping for it," he confessed. Kakashi smiled. When he pulled down his mask, Madara's blush deepened. And when he kissed the man for the first time, he could feel the heat of it. There was a saying which proclaimed that one should never meet their heroes. Kakashi decided that he could be convinced otherwise. Chapter 5, Shikamaru and Neja, the one where first words appear on your on. The day of Neja's 6th birthday was unremarkable compared to most others of the Hyuga clan. He wasn't a part of the head family, so the celebration wasn't large. In fact, the only reason he'd had a formal celebration at all was because his father was twin of the clan head himself. Neja had been born at 3 p.m. on the 3rd of July. So, on that day and at nearly that time, his close family gathered around him and rolled up the sleeves of the formal kimono he had dressed himself in with father's help. Neja found himself excited in a muted kind of way. Every child in the world was excited for their 6th birthday. On this day, at the time of your birth, the first words that your soulmate would speak to you would appear on your on. Neja rather hoped that the brand would read a cousin, the first word that little Hinata had ever said to him. Hinata was pretty, but that wasn't why it mattered. Even at 6 years old, Neja could tell that he was stronger than her. His clan deserved someone strong as their head, and if he was destined to be paired with Hinata, then he could be that person. And only then could he abolish the tradition of the Hyuga curse mark. With all eyes in the room trained on his arms, Neja held them out straight as the clock chimed 3 times. At first nothing happened, then slowly golden letters began to blur. They started off blurry and mushed together. It took a few seconds for them to shift and spread until they had settled to form only one word. It was, disappointingly, not the word that he had hoped for. It read troublesome. Frowning at first, Neja wasn't sure whether to be disappointed or not. That didn't seem like a very encouraging message for a first meeting. He was further disheartened when his uncle made a derisive noise to his left. I suppose that makes it easy to tell which clan your match is in, Hayasha sneered in a manner that made his disapproval obvious. Neja fought back a scowl. It wouldn't do to disrespect the head of his clan right to the man's face. As frustrating as it was that none of the adults would elaborate on that comment, Neja stayed quiet. The rest of the small celebration was rather quiet, and conversation mostly turned toward speculations about what Lady Hinata's soul brand would show when she turned 6 next year. When dinner was finished and Neja returned to his rooms along with his father, the young boy decided that it must not matter. He was branch family and thus lived only to serve the main family. If the head of the clan did not approve of the one who was supposed to be his soulmate, it was within the man's power to deny the match and choose one he found more palatable. The day that Neja received his soul brand, he realized the true extent of the cage that held him. The day of Neja's 26th birthday was a rather loud affair. With people like Naruto and Lee and his group of friends, it was a wonder he had managed to talk them out of their terrible bar-hopping idea. Still, the evening had been more pleasant than he imagined, full of good food and well-wishers, and all the people he cared for the most gathered all together. A hand running down his arm caused Neja to turn away from the spectacle that Lee was making while trying to convince Tenten to dance with him. The acrobatics she employed to avoid his grasp were rather humorous. When he looked up, it was into the face of Naru Shikamaru, who graced him with a lazy smile. "Enjoying yourself?" the younger man asked. Neja nodded once, reaching over to entwine their fingers. "It isn't too terrible," he allowed in as haughty a voice as he could manage. His playful pretension and him a chuckle as they both thought back to how difficult a child he had been. Their meeting had been neither smooth nor romantic. He had all but rejected his other half right from the start, and it had been a long journey to get where they were now. The words "You're in my way" would forever rebuke him, written in gold. "If His Birthday Highness isn't satisfied, I could tell everyone to go home," Shikamaru offered with mock seriousness. Neja huffed. "Troublesome," he muttered and hid a grin. Shikamaru laughed and bumped their shoulders together. As difficult as their road to happiness had been, it had been more than worth it. Neja would forever be grateful for his partner's patience and perseverance. What he had done to deserve someone so wonderful was beyond him. Someday he hoped to find the words to tell the other man just how indebted he was to him for the love that they now shared. Because with Shikamaru at his side, Neja was free. Chapter 6, Hashirama and Madara, the one where you remember your past lives. Hashirama sometimes dreamed of war. Not the war that played on the news on television all the time, men and women firing automatic weapons at each other in far-off places. No, Hashirama dreamed of chaotic warring states in a world where men and women mold the elements with only their hands. He dreamed of child soldiers and kunai and a family that looked like his but different, angrier, deadlier. Most often, however, he dreamed of a person. Sometimes he was a boy with messy black hair, a wild smile, and drains of peace to protect their loved ones. Other times he was a man broken by hatred and betrayal, bathed in blood and screaming while they clashed their swords against each other. Hashirama had never mentioned the drains to anyone before. He knew what they were, of course. Hashirama dreamed of his soulmate and the life they had lived in a previous incarnation. Sometimes in the privacy of his room he tried to call on his chakra the way he had been able to in that life. It never worked quite the same, but he could feel the energy simmering just below his skin, and that was enough for him to believe that it had all been real. 1 month before his 16th birthday, the first day of a new school year, Hashirama stepped into his new homeroom class with a smile on his face. He wasn't particularly good in school, but his naturally cheerful disposition ensured that he always had friends to lean on everywhere he went. As he headed towards the back to sit next to someone he knew, a shoulder bumped into his. "Watch it," someone growled at him. Sorry, he replied, turning to see who was there. The moment he laid eyes on the boy, it was as if all the air had been sucked from his lungs. Wild black hair framed a face that he had known since his earliest memories. Dark eyes looked back at him with the same surprise he currently felt. Thin brows, a straight nose, and a rounded chin formed the handsomest face he had ever seen. Hashirama felt a wide smile blooming across his own. "Hi, I'm Hashirama," he said quietly. The boy blinked and nodded slowly. "Madara," he answered shortly. He jumped when Hashirama put a hand on his shoulder, giving it a quick squeeze. "Let's have a happier ending than the last time, okay?" Madara's smirk is just as he remembers it from his dreams. The past had been hard and full of hurt. Somehow he just knows that this future will be better. Chapter 7, Tobirama Academy, the one where you stop aging. Tobirama tugged fitfully on the hair that brushed the tips of his ears, a habit he had developed during his 18th year when his body had frozen in time and it had stopped growing. If asked how old he was now, Tobirama would answer that he was still 18. He had been the same age for 15 years, and whenever he tugged on the hair above his ear, it was a surefire sign that something was bothering him. Sometimes it was annoyance over whatever his brother had done this time. Sometimes it was nerves because one of their patrols should have been home 3 days ago. Right now it was restlessness over having to wait for something he should have been a part of. Next to him, Hashirama eyed the hair tugging and smiled, though he said nothing. Hashirama had spent only 2 years at the age of 18 before he had begun to age again, though he hadn't actually met his soulmate until a few years after that. Tobirama often envied him. It must be nice to have someone the way that his brother had Mida, someone to welcome him home and hold him close at night. Tobirama had been waiting for his someone for a long time now. Sometimes he was sure he would never find them, not even if he someday, finally, began to age again. He was aware that re-aging could mean one of two things: either your soulmate had also reached 18 years old, or it meant that they had died before that age. As his fingers tugged on his lux one more, Hashirama finally turned to him and reached out, stilling his pale hand with a large tanned one and lowering it back to his side. "Everything will be fine, little brother," the Hokage tried to comfort him. Tobirama sighed and crossed his arms. "I should have been here for the last months of their training," he grumbled for what may have been the 100th time. He was still wearing the clothes he had been wearing when he arrived in the village only hours before. Travel dust clung to every crevice on his body and he couldn't wait to bathe. "I needed you in the land of lightning," Hashirama reiterated from a conversation they'd already had. It was a delicate situation and I needed someone capable of diplomacy. "I love Madara like family, but is not the best at being diplomatic when he disagrees with something." Tobirama huffed and muttered, "I didn't even get the chance to see them before everything started. I haven't wished any of them good luck." Hashirama shook his head, smiling once again. "They know you wish them the best," was all he offered. Tobirama sighed again. His two genin teens had grown so much since he had first began their training. Today they were to take the genin selection exam for the first time, and he was certain that almost all of them would pass. Danza, perhaps, he would hope, was held back. There were certain ideals that the boy held which were the healthiest, and he hoped to work on them more before the boy was declared fully independent. Hiruzen and Kagami, on the other hand, were the two he was most certain of. If either of them went chosen as genin, he would be demanding explanations from someone. The exams were private, unlike the Chunin selections. As their teacher he should have been allowed to spectate, but he had arrived too late. All he could do now was wait here until the 6 young students he had trained came out to tell him their news. He didn't notice that his hand had returned to his hair until Hashirama caught it with his own again. He gave his brother an exasperated look when he didn't let go, then raised an eyebrow when he noticed the older man's sudden scrutiny. "What?" he growled. Hashirama tilted his head like a curious puppy. "Brother, has your hair grown?" The hand holding his let go so that it could poke at his white locks. Tobirama stared at him like he had lost his mind before batting the hand away and snapping, "Don't be ridiculous. It hasn't grown since the day I turned 18. He frowned when his brother didn't stop staring, only leaned in to inspect him closer. "I'm serious, Tobirama. It looks longer." "You've never been serious a day in your life," he murmured absently even as he gripped some of his fringe and pulled it down, eyeing it critically. "Was it longer?" Heedless of how ridiculous he would look if someone were to walk in right then, he pulled the hair as straight as possible so that it pressed up against his face, gauging it against where he knew it should have ended. His heart skipped a beat when he realized that Hashirama was right. "It is longer," he breathed. "My hair is growing." The two brothers looked at each other, both with their eyebrows raised in surprise. Tobirama had been alive for 36 years and only now did he begin re-aging. Had his soulmate come of age? "Do you know anyone who turned 18 recently?" Hashirama asked as that ridiculously too large smile of his spread across his face. Tobirama swallowed while his eyes widened in alarm. "2 of my students," he whispered. "2 of them had birthdays while I was away." He was suddenly finding it difficult to draw breath. Hashirama gripped his shoulder bracingly as he stared into space and tried to process what this meant. Tobirama had been waiting for his soulmate for a very long time. The idea that he might finally find them was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. He found himself unprepared. He had no idea how to romance someone or how to date. He had no idea how to navigate the traps and pitfalls of a relationship. His only example was his brother and Mida, and he was sure that their relationship was not the norm. Hashirama was the most powerful man in all the 5 elemental lands, yet Mida had the man eating out of her palm and bowing at her feet. The prospect that it might be one of his students also contributed largely to his sudden anxiety. Only one of the 2 that had had a birthday was female. The possibility of Koharu as the one he was destined to be with was not pleasant to say the least. He was fond of her as a student, but he was sure they could not make each other happy romantically. Calming himself with deep breaths, Tobirama told himself that all he could do at the moment was wait and see. It was yet another hour until the final participant had completed their task for the final exam. Hashirama left him alone and he used that time to calm himself. No one outside of the competition knew what the tasks were and he was looking forward to hearing what they had all been asked to do to prove their worth as elite shinobi. When finally the door opened and young men and women began to file out of the enclosed testing area, Tobirama's hand automatically sought the hair above his ear again, tucking fitfully without noticing. The first of his students that appeared was Hiruzen, who headed towards him with a proud grin. Tobirama offered a small smile of his own. "Well done," he said, not needing to hear the words to know that one of his most skilled has passed. Hiruzen bowed respectfully. "It's all thanks to you, sensei. We wouldn't have made it anywhere near as far as we did without you." "Damn right." Torifu stepped up beside his friend with a smile just as proud and his ever-present bag of snacks in one hand. "Sensei, check it out. We are Jainin now." "Yes, I see that," Tobirama indulged him while some of the others wormed their way through the crowd. He looked up as Danzo arrived, just in time to hear the disgruntled young man growl, "Something's different about you." It wasn't that surprising. Trust Danzo, of them all, to notice right away. He'd always had extremely keen eyes, able to notice small details at a glance. "Your hair, it's longer." Before he could respond, Torifu scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. Sensei's hair can't grow." He rolled his eyes, but Koharu, appearing between them, pinched his arm. It could if his soulmate reached 18, she reminded him. They all stopped and gave her a significant look. Koharu cleared her throat and took a deep breath before meeting her sensei's eyes. It was with a large amount of relief on both sides that they came to the same conclusion: they were not each other's soulmates. Though they were both of age, there was no pull between them. Koharu said with relief. Tobirama did so internally, though he refrained from being obvious about it and shook his head to inform the others of the good news. It was best to keep their relationship as student and sensei. They would never be closer than that. The crowd parted to their left and two bodies stumbled into their small corner gathering. Kagami leaned on Homura with his eyes closed, fanning himself. Homura was bent over taking large gulps of air. The pair of them looked as if they had released a fire jetso in a broom closet while still standing inside it. All right, Jainin promotion or not, I would not recommend pissing off Proctor Ogawa. That was close. Kagami straightened up and looked around, frowning when he noticed his teammates staring at him. What? I didn't mean to. Most of them shook their head. Kohara grinned in a feral manner. Guess what, Kagami? Sensei started re-aging, she cooed. Didn't you just have a birthday? Kagami shrugged and said, "You're a couple months ago, but I don't see what that has to do with Sensei. Although, congrats, Sensei. Did you find them yet?" He looked over finally, making eye contact with Tobirama for the first time. It felt a bit like someone reaching down into his very core, gripping his soul itself, and pulling hard in one direction. That direction being Kagami. They stared at each other in surprise. Tobirama wondered why he hadn't even considered this. Probably because Kagami was male and soulmate pairings between two of the same gender simply weren't as common. They happened, of course, but it was believed by many that soulmates were supposed to be genetically matched for the perfect offspring. Tobirama had always secretly thought that was utter horseshit. Soulmates were for love. And his soulmate was his student. A thinker just did, he heard someone say. It sounded like his own voice, but he couldn't remember speaking. I knew it. Kohara crowed while the others around them gaped in surprise. Kagami and Tobirama continued to stare at one another in silence until Torifu took one of their arms each in his massive, meaty hands. This should be private, guys, give them a minute alone. With that, Tobirama found himself and his soulmate shoved into one of the empty rooms off of the meeting area that was still full of people. The door slammed behind them and he found himself alone with Uchiha Kagami, the soulmate he had been waiting for all his life. He had no idea what to say. Or do. He stared in wonder, taking in everything about Kagami that he noticed a million times before but couldn't help noticing again. Like almost everyone in his clan, Kagami had inky black hair and matching eyes. His locks were slightly curly and bounced when he ran. Tobirama happened to know that if he ruffled the young man's hair, the locks would jump back into place like gently coiled springs. He had the same finely cut features as anyone from his heritage could expect, although his eyes were gentler than mice. He was of average height, standing several inches below Tobirama, just enough that he could bend and tuck his head under the elder's chin. Tobirama swallowed and looked away, picturing it. Are you disappointed, Sensei? The young man's quiet voice made his head snap back around. Disappointed, he repeated, stunned. No. Just very surprised. A thought came to him and he tugged at the hair that had started everything. Are you? Kagami shook his head vehemently and exclaimed, not at all. It's that well. Promise you won't laugh. Tobirama nodded once. I've sort of had a crush on you ever since I hit puberty. I used to pretend that you were my soulmate just waiting for me to grow up. The fact that you actually are is, well. Tobirama stared at him, even more unsure of what to say now. Kagami offered him a sheepish grin and a shrug, entirely unrepentant in the face of his dreams coming true. The Senju wasn't sure what to do with knowing that someone had thought of him that way. He'd never seen himself as particularly desirable. His looks were usually described as strange and his personality as cold. Apparently the universe really did know what it was doing, pairing him with the one person who had ever seen any sort of romantic worth in him. I'm not entirely sure what to do now, he finally admitted in a quiet voice. It was a hard thing to admit. He was used to being the sensei, the leader. Now he would need to learn to see Kagami as a partner instead, and equal in all things. When Kagami smiled, he noticed for some reason how attractive it was. He'd never noticed that before. Well, I've got something we could try, the Uchiha said. Tobirama made a curious sound. Instead of answering, Kagami quickly covered the small distance between them and surprised him by landing a kiss directly on his lips, slowing his momentum just in time for the gesture to be soft and tender rather than a spontaneous headbutt. When the younger man pulled away, Tobirama stared at him with saucer-wide eyes, his brain completely shutting down. To his horror, he could feel a magnificent blush rising on his cheeks. He hadn't blushed since going through puberty at the age of 12, when he'd discovered his brother's stash of magazines. "Oh my God, sensei!" Kagami squealed upon seeing his blush. "Don't kiss me and call me sensei." Tobirama growled, as usual resorting to anger to cover his emotions. Long used to him, Kagami grinned and leaned in for a second kiss. Tobirama made a soft noise of surprise, but he managed to kiss back this time, drawing it out until Kagami was the one making noises in the back of his throat. This time when they parted, they were both flushed. It was only partly from embarrassment. Kagami cleared his throat and asked, "So what do I call you then?" in a voice that was strangely husky. Tobirama shifted his weight, feeling strange. "By my name, of course." His former student hummed contemplatively. Then he grinned darkly. "I always called you Tobirama in my dreams," he said. The sentry gaped, stuttering through a few half-sentences of gibberish as he tried to think of a way to respond. He'd never imagined that he would be so flustered by all this. Then, of course, his traitor mouth had to open again without his permission. "What else did you dream about?" By the glint in Kagami's eye, he was sure he would regret that question. Chapter 8, Kakashi Obada, the one where you feel their emotions. When Kakashi was younger, he had a soulmate. He knew because he could feel their emotions the way he was supposed to. Not always, it was only the extreme emotions that bled through the tenuous connection. He could feel when they were very angry or very happy. It bothered him that they were often very sad. If he'd known who it was back then, he would have found them and made whatever had hurt them go away. Even at a young age, Kakashi had been strong. Throughout some of his childhood, Kakashi had noticed a pattern. His soulmate often felt anger or fear at the same time that he did. He wondered then if it might have something to do with them being so in sync with each other, or if it was only coincidence that the events of their days matched up so well. It was just strange that every time he got into an argument with Obada, they also felt angry, and every time Rin started flirting with him, they also felt annoyed. It never occurred to him that perhaps they might be experiencing the same emotions because they were experiencing the same events together. On the day he lost Obada, Kakashi had felt the boy's pain. He had woken from his blow to the head to feel it rippling through his mind, making him grit his teeth to bite back the screams. When his eyes fell upon Obada, it had all come crashing down on him. His soulmate had been there in front of him all this time, and he had never known. And now his soulmate lay dying, crushed and bleeding under a boulder that had been meant for him. When the cave continued to collapse, Kakashi had pulled Rin to safety and the two of them escaped together, but Kakashi had felt Obada's pain for a long time afterwards. It had taken him over an hour to die. Kakashi had wished he could die in his place. In the months that followed, Kakashi's emotions were all over the place. He felt like he was going out of his head, unable to concentrate, feeling strange things at strange times. It was as if his brain were creating the ghosts of emotions that Obada should be feeling as a strange method of coping with the loss of a soulmate he had never gotten to be with. He felt himself slipping more and more until things culminated during the mission that cost him Rin. As he stared into her eyes, his arm through her chest, his emotions were so intense and varied that he couldn't process them all. He felt despair, confusion, helplessness, rage. As she whispered his name and fell backwards, already dead, Kakashi's mind overloaded, and for a while he blacked out. When he came to, the enemy were no more, and he lay surrounded by blood and corpses. As if that short circuit had finally jolted the echoes of emotions from him, all Kakashi felt after that was numb. He felt empty inside and out. Things worsened a year later when he lost Minato-sensei. Everything and everyone that had ever been able to evoke emotion from him had slipped through his fingers one by one, leaving him to go on alone with a dead heart. Life wasn't happy when he could feel nothing, but in some ways it was easier. It was easier to do his job when he didn't care. It was easier to end a life when he didn't feel. It was easier to withstand torture when he couldn't hurt. When he felt anything, it was muted, quiet. He would be a little annoyed when his plans went wrong. He would be a little worried when his A and BU comrades were in danger. They were, after all, his responsibility, and he had made it a personal mission to keep as many soldiers alive as possible, so that they could continue to fight for the village, of course. Meeting his genin was like ripping a bandage off of a wound that had never closed. Kakashi looked at his 3 little students and saw the faces that were frozen in a photograph by his bedside. Being around them brought emotions back to him that he had thought were beyond his reach forever. He began to feel again. It was painful. It was also very worth it. Even after Sasuke betrayed them and left the village, having Naruto and Sakura in his life was like having a pair of sons that he could warm himself by when the days got cold and lonely. As the 4th shinobi war crested and broke its waves of fear across the shinobi nations, Kakashi realized that he felt something that he had not felt since he had lost his soulmate. He felt love. He loved his students and he loved his friends. He would do anything, give anything to keep them alive. As he marched to battle at the head of the 3rd Division, he vowed to do everything he could to protect the few that he had left. As the skirmishes wore on and he joined Naruto in battle against the one who called himself Todi, Kakashi felt a strange mix of the numbness from his younger years and the newer, warmer emotions that he had rediscovered. Flashes of anger and despair confused him, but there was little time to be distracted. Not when the final prize of this battle was the fate of the world itself. And then the mask fell away and Kakashi could not have described how he felt, not with an entire dictionary full of words. As pain and hurt and confusion tore through him, paralyzing his body, he could see Obito wince. Obito, who should be dead. Obito, who was trying to destroy the world. Obito, who looked at him and he could feel the anger building up and flooding the connection he had thought broken years ago. They clashed. They fought the way they used to, bringing all of their jutsu and skill to bear. Except this time Kakashi found that his heart simply wasn't in it. He had no desire to defeat Obito, only to stop him from putting his insane plans into action. It was his reluctance that doomed him. Kakashi was smart. He could put things together from the clues given to him. He could tell that Obito, unlike him, had never realized who his true soulmate was. Ren's death had caused them both pain and entered both of their hearts, and Kakashi had spent the rest of his life feeling things only faintly, not strongly enough for it to be felt by the other. It seemed that the discovery of Kakashi having been his soulmate, not their other teammate, was not being handled well. A revived Uchiha Madara was terrifying. Otsutsuki Kaguya was beautiful and terrifying. The infinite Tsukiyomi was beyond all comprehension. Still Kakashi forced his tired body and weeping mind to fight on. His chest felt like it was on a roller coaster as at first it seemed that Obito was dead again, then he was alive to help them fight. Then he was hopping dimensions with Sakura. Then finally, for the first time since they were 12 years old, Kakashi and Obito stood side by side, fighting together towards a common goal. When the bone spear pierced Obito's body, Kakashi felt it in his own. He watched the man he should have lived a life with crumble to ash, his heart crumbling with him. Obito's last words were for Naruto, not him, and somehow that was what hurt the most. Though they had reconciled in the end, it seemed that he had truly never meant anything special to his other half. Or so he thought. He could barely react as the still warm ashes of his soulmate suddenly began to emit a familiar chakra, and he found himself in a limbo state similar to the one he had met his father in on the day he had nearly died. There, he and Obito were able to have the final words that there hadn't been time for before. Kakashi felt his soulmate's chakra flooding through his system as, for the last time, he wielded his borrowed Sharingan. It was an incredible sensation. For just that one short moment in time they were completely one with each other. Yet, like all of the other good things in Kakashi's life, it ended too soon. Obito was passing on and he told Kakashi not to hurry. They were able to say their final goodbyes as friends. It was better than their last parting, which he was thankful for, but still he mourned for what they could have had. As he watched Obito fade from his sight and felt his chakra fade from his body, Kakashi felt a strange dichotomy within himself. He felt hollower and lonelier than ever before in his life. His soulmate was truly gone this time and circumstances had stolen what happiness should have been theirs. Yet, he also felt light, open, free. In the end Obito had forgiven him. In the end he still had friends and precious students. His life would go on without an epic tale of passion. He would never experience the fulfillment that he read about in his romance novels. But that did not mean that it would be empty. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. And when he finally laid his head down to rest, he knew Obada was waiting for him. They would have the rest of eternity to spend together. Chapter 9, Sai Sasuke, the one where you have a red thread on your wrist. Sai was born with a red string around his wrist. Almost all babies were. The string was supposed to lead you to your soulmate, to that one person who you were meant to be with. Sai did not remember his parents or his earliest years. The first memory that Sai could recall was the day that he untied the string. When the knot came undone, the thread leading out of the room ceased to be visible, leaving only a short length of string dangling from his hand. He placed it in his bedside table and resolved to forget about it. He was a member of Root, and this was no place for soulmates. Emotions and desires did not belong here. For a few years it worked, and Sai did not think at all about that red string or the fact that his perfect match was somewhere out there, unable to find him. He served under Danzo in the organization, following orders without question or feeling. It took until he was 16 for things to change. It took meeting Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto had a way about him that made you believe in things, made you feel things. After only a few months of knowing Naruto, Sai began to think about the string that he had hid away from himself. If he tied it back on, what would he find at the other end? Could there really still be a match out there for someone like him? After all the things he had done, he was inclined to believe he didn't deserve them. With doubt in his heart, Sai put things off for a long time. He reasoned with himself each time that he was only being practical. He needed to help Naruto search for Sasuke. There was little time to spend on his own agenda. He needed to serve Konoha and the war to save shinobi kind. That wouldn't be a good environment to meet someone in. He needed to help support Kakashi-sensei, now Hokage-sama, as he sought to calm the world after the upheaval caused by the war and usher in a new era of peace. Years went by and Sai made up excuse after excuse until finally he admitted to himself what was really going on. He was afraid. Tying that string on his wrist and following the thread to the other end was a huge risk for someone like him. What if he had been broken by Root? What if he wasn't capable of loving his soulmate the way he was supposed to? He was terrified that they wouldn't understand and he would lose them before they even had a chance to begin the journey together. Once again it took Naruto Uzumaki to get him going. "Don't be stupid," were the exact words that the tactless blonde had used, Sakura nodding beside him. "They're your soulmate, of course they'll understand. Of course they'll want you." With that said, Sai had been marched straight into his sparse bedroom where he opened his bedside drawer and observed the treasure inside. The red color of the string had never faded, staying as bright and bold as the day he was born. Plucking it from its dark resting place, Sai held it up in front of his eyes, wondering if it had been this long when he was a child. Did the string grow with him to fit whatever size he grew to be? Get on with it. Sakura huffed, having no patience for his philosophical wanderings. "Here, gimme." Without further ado, the pink-haired woman had grabbed his wrist and tied the string around it with an intricate knot. As soon as it settled into place, Sai could see the thread that led from his wrist out the window, leading him away through the village and possibly beyond. It would be visible only to him and whoever waited at the other end. The XANBU frowned in uncertainty. Should he follow it now? Should he wait for his soulmate to find him? Perhaps there was a book in the library that might tell him the protocols of a situation like this. Come on. Let's follow it. Sai looked up in slight alarm as Naruto and Sakura both grabbed on, turning him about and dragging him through his tiny apartment. "But it doesn't go this way," he protested faintly. His two teammates stopped and stared at him. "Should we be doing this? Am I supposed to follow it? Maybe I should go to the library." Naruto groaned and declared, "No libraries. No books. Where does it go?" Reluctantly, Sai pointed out where the thread was leading him. The three of them turned around as one unit and headed back through his bedroom, climbing out the window and down the fire escape. As unsure as he was about this whole thing, he found that he was glad to have such strong bonds as he did with Naruto and Sakura. He was grateful not to be doing this alone. Following his string took them on a meandering journey through back alleys and side streets, showing them a side of Konoha none of them had taken the time to explore before. Sakura told him it was a good sign that the string spent so much time wandering through the village. It increased the chances that his soulmate was here instead of somewhere in another village. If that were the case, then he would have needed to request leave to try and go find them. Eventually the thread led him to a building. More specifically, a hotel. Ignoring the girl at the desk despite her polite greeting, the trio followed the trail all the way up to the 3rd floor. There, they found themselves standing outside of room 316. Sai stared at the wooden barrier before him, his heart beating wildly. On the other side of this door was his soulmate. On the other side of this door was Hope. He was not so distracted, however, to miss the significant look that passed between his two companions. He offered them what he hoped was a curious face. "What is it?" he asked. Naruto rubbed the back of his head. "That's Sasuke's room," the blonde informed him. "He's back for a while. Checking in with Kakashi-sensei, you know. I wonder why your soulmate is visiting Sasuke." Sakura gave her friend an incredulous look as she muttered, "You are such an idiot." Then she turned back to encourage Sai to knock on the door. With his stomach in his throat, he did so. A deep voice called from inside, asking them to wait. Sai looked down and fiddled with the string on his wrist, running a finger along it and trying to imagine what his person would look like. Would they be tall? Short? Thin? Muscled? He tried to think of what he might prefer, but such preferences had been beaten out of him at a young age. He wondered if they would mind that. When the door opened, Sai slowly looked up from his wrist to see Uchiha Sasuke standing in the doorway. It wasn't so surprising. It was, after all, his hotel room. What was surprising was that the string around Sai's wrist ran along the ground to connect directly to the one tied around Sasuke's wrist. The Uchiha followed where he was looking and his eyes widened in shock. "You?" Sasuke exclaimed. He didn't sound happy, although he didn't sound upset either. He mostly just sounded surprised, like he had never considered this outcome. "Holy crap, your soulmate is Sasuke." Naruto's voice boomed right next to his ear. "Such an idiot," Sakura mourned. "Did you really not see it coming? You told him it was Sasuke's room." Sai eyed the man in front of him with a critical eye and found himself not at all disappointed. Once he thought about it, it actually made a great deal of sense. He couldn't think of a single person he could relate to more. Sasuke was every bit as broken as he was. They would understand each other very well. With happy feelings blossoming inside him, Sai put on the most sincere smile that he could muster. "Hello, soulmate." Chapter 10, Kakashi Baruka, the one where color spills from your lips. Baruka giggled as he squirmed farther back into the branches of the tree he had settled in. He knew from experience that this spot was excellent for hiding from his angry elders, and right now he really needed a place to hide. He'd set off a smoke bomb in class because Nobuyuki-sensei had been extra boring that day. Once he'd escaped the classroom, it had naturally followed that the 12-year-old pulled as many pranks as he could around town before someone figured out it was him. Getting chased was fun. It meant that the grown-ups had to pay attention to him, even if just for a little while. Baruka liked making them search for him. Making them go through so much effort was the best part. A rustle of leaves only a few trees to the south had him stifling his giggles behind a hand, hiding the wide grin on his face. No one had ever found him in this hiding spot, and he was sure they wouldn't now. He didn't know what had made the hole in the tree, but the way the branches grew meant that it was completely invisible unless he knew it was there. His small body was the perfect size for curling up into it and disappearing while the adults went whizzing by, muttering angrily to themselves about whatever prank he had most recently pulled. His smug thoughts were broken when a hand suddenly reached through his leafy cover, pulling aside the branches to reveal the mask of an ANBU agent. He gaped up at them in consternation. A grinning mask with painted streaks depicting a stylized dog stared back at him. Behind the mask, someone huffed irritably, then the hand not holding branches aside reached into his hidey hole and grasped him by the scruff of the neck. Baruka squawked indignantly as he was hauled out and held up in the air like a doll. Flailing his limbs did absolutely nothing to loosen the iron hold on him, so he went still and settled for crossing his arms and glaring. The ANBU chuckled but said nothing. It wasn't a deep and scary laugh as one might expect of the demons that parents used to scare children into good behavior. It was soft and slightly higher than was typical of a grown man. It made Baruka stop and take a good look at his captor. The uniform was tight and minimal, showcasing the scrawny limbs and elongated torso of someone in the midst of a growth spurt they hadn't fully completed yet. Messy hair spilled in every direction possible, swaying with the slight breeze and obscuring the edges of their mask. Under the armor flexed the muscles of someone who trained hard every day and had done so for a long time. One thing stuck in Aruka's mind: this was not the body of an adult. His captor could not be much older than himself. Of course, as soon as curiosity took hold of his mind, his mouth followed behind at a mile a minute. "You're ANBU. How old are you?" "You can't be older than me by much." "I'm Aruka. I'm 12. How did you get to ANBU so young?" "Will you teach me? You must know lots of cool tricks." "I like playing tricks." "Why don't you say anything? Are you shy, ANBU-san?" "It's okay, I'll be your friend." "How did you find me?" "Wait, I know. You're a dog, so did you smell me?" His flow of questions stopped at last when a gloved finger was pressed against his lips. He hadn't registered how still the other boy was until he had suddenly moved, and it succeeded in startling him into silence. That was when he noticed how the finger against his lips was trembling. Slowly, the older boy set him on his feet so they stood facing each other on the thick tree branch a dozen feet above the ground. Aruka watched as his captor lifted the hand that had held him to remove the porcelain dog mask. He gasped in delight as it was lowered. He'd heard that ANBU were never supposed to remove their disguise. Then he groaned in exasperation when he saw that there was another mask underneath, this one formed of black spandex. One dark eye was staring at him in wonder, its twin held closed almost as if by the scar that ran through it. He'd been right in his estimation of age. The boy that was awkwardly clearing his throat couldn't be more than a few years above him. His entire world was then turned upside down by the softly spoken words, "Hello, Aruka. My name is Kakashi." He watched, fascinated, as the world around him lit up with color. It looked as though beams of every color imaginable were spilling from the older boy's mouth with each word, streaking away to find their places in the forest scenery. He remembered his parents, before they had died, telling him stories of the day they had met. They had told him he would know his soulmate the moment he met them because they would put color into Aruka's world. He hadn't known what colors were. He'd had no idea they were this beautiful. "Wow," he whispered, watching the beams of color trailing off into the air. His gaze snapped back to the eye that was watching him carefully. "A soulmate. I've got a soulmate. Hi, Kakashi." Then he leapt forward to throw his arms around the boy, who caught him with a surprised grunt. He felt a hand hesitantly cradle the back of his head where it pressed into the ANBU's chest plate. "Yeah. Hi." Kakashi, he decided, was slightly awkward. That was okay, though. Kakashi was his soulmate, and Aruka already knew that he would love him with his entire tiny heart. Chapter 11, Karen is Swajetsu, the one where you have a name on each wrist. The first time Karen met Swajetsu, she decided straight away that he must be her enemy. The red ink of his name on her left wrist seemed to mock her as she watched him through the glass of his holding tank. His body was only half formed inside the water, causing him to ripple and blow while he spoke with aura chimera. He was boastful and loud, two things she had never appreciated. Karen was more used to the quiet, to being forgotten in a corner until her skills were needed. Swajetsu, it seemed, was the type of person to force people to remember him by getting right up in their faces. She showed her contempt of him by taking part in the experiments aura chimera performed on the young man. She told herself that she didn't like the way he smelled of the ocean no matter how long they kept him locked up in the eastern hideout. She told herself that his white hair and lavender eyes were an ugly combination and his sharp teeth weren't attractive at all. She was destined to be an enemy to this loudmouth, and she made sure that he knew it, especially when he finally learned her name and she saw him glance at his own left wrist. The first time Karen met Sasuke, she absolutely knew that he was her soulmate. He was cool and ruthless, strong and handsome, and she knew with a certainty that his name and red on her right wrist must mean love. Although Sasuke never showed her his own wrists, she was sure that her name must be written there. It had to be. Sasuke was every girl's dream, but it was her that was marked to be with him. She showed him her love by following his orders and joining his team when he asked it of her. Sasuke played hard to get quite well, but it never deterred her in her quest to finally earn his favor. Her theory was that Sasuke must have two girls' names on his wrist and was withholding judgment on which one she was. She therefore put all of her time and energy into convincing him that she was the most perfect match for him. Karen told herself that she loved his favorite foods. She told herself that the strange choppy cut of his hair was endearing, not at all awkward looking. She told herself she wasn't afraid of him, whispered it in the back of her mind when he looked at her with cold, indifferent eyes. The months the three of them spent together, with Jugo as Team Taka and later Team Hebi, could only be described as surreal. Karen had spent years under the thumb of Aura Chimera, slowly learning to build herself up despite the way that Snake Man sought to hold her mind and spirit down. She had self-confidence and self-respect, finally, after a childhood of being used and thrown away like trash. So Karen told herself that throwing away her own desires to always be what Sasuke needed was just her being a good soulmate. She told herself that every time he ignored her he was just plain hard to get. She told herself that the way Suigetsu watched her with rolling eyes and scornful words didn't hurt. She would win her soulmate in the end. Sasuke would make her happy. Karen became so good at willingly pulling the wool over her own eyes that the day Sasuke betrayed her, she could say she truly never saw it coming. The blade of lightning through her chest hurt more than just physically. It felt as if Sasuke had pierced her soul, her drains. In one bloody gesture he had torn apart the illusions she had blinded herself with and left her with nothing but regrets. The shock of it lasted through her healing and her journey to the Leaf Village to be their prisoner. When her stupor finally started to lift, Karen was sitting in a cell in the interrogation department, staring at the names written across her wrists in red. With a gentle finger she traced the name she had always scorned, following the vein that ran underneath, connected directly to her heart. Perhaps Suigetsu deserved more thought. It was possible she had been wrong. Chapter 12, Kakashi Hana, the one where you have a tattoo of your soulmate's passion. Hana loved her work more than absolutely everything. Working with animals was her true calling, and she could not imagine a more fulfilling vocation. Every day she brought joy and health to the lives of dogs, cats, rabbits, and any number of other small animals. Her specialty, however, was in dogs, and she felt no guilt about having a soft spot for them. She was an Inuzuka after all. She was, however, slightly embarrassed to have a favorite client. She would allow her bonded companion to bite whoever pointed it out, but Hana might have dressed a little nicer than usual today after seeing who her last appointment was. Hate Kakashi was half the reason her clinic stayed in business. With 8 dogs to take care of, it was rare for a full month to pass by without him booking an appointment for one thing or another. Hana adored every single one of his dogs. She also happened to adore him as well. It was hard not to, considering the older man was nothing more than an oversized puppy. Getting through the day was hard when the one appointment she was excited about getting to was scheduled for the very end of her shift. The hours seemed to drag until her lunch break and then continued to drag afterward. Finally, as she was finishing up some paperwork about the operation from last week, Hana's nose twitched. She smiled as a familiar scent wafted in from the waiting room. It seemed that Kakashi had arrived with Bull. Not wanting to seem overeager, Hana waited until her assistant came to let her know that they were here before standing and making her way out of her tiny office. Kakashi was sitting on the floor with his legs splayed out. Bull sat in between his knees, attempting to bathe his owner's face with sloppy kisses from a slobbery wet tongue while Kakashi guarded his face with his hands and laughed. Hana took a moment to enjoy the sight in silence, allowing the man a moment to enjoy himself. Not many people were aware of her friendship with Kakashi, as the two of them generally ran in different social circles. He seemed to like it that way, though, as it made her clinic one of the few places that he could let go of things and just be himself. When Bull lifted one paw and started to push against Kakashi's shoulder, almost toppling the poor man, Hana finally alerted them to her presence. Not that they hadn't known she was there before. Kakashi's sense of smell was on par with her own. "Is that my favorite bulldog? Who's a good boy, Bull? Who's a good boy?" The gigantic canine immediately abandoned his owner in favor of turning to her with a deep booming woof, tongue lolling out as he grinned happily. Hana smiled and rubbed at his floppy ears. On the floor, Kakashi lowered his hands at last to peek up at her. He was wearing a grin of his own. "Thank you," he said meekly, obviously holding in a laugh. She shook her head in mock disapproval. "You're supposed to be the boss, Hatak. How can you let him corner you like that?" She tutted as she turned and walked away, Bull following at her heels and Kakashi scrambling to do the same. His footfalls made no noise, but she could hear him right behind her as he said, "Hun, and I suppose you never let Natsuki boss you around?" Hana chose not to answer him, ignoring the way her wolfhound companion huffed amusedly as they entered the room. Instead, she gathered her implements and got straight to Bull's checkup while Kakashi collapsed into his favorite chair in the corner. Out of the corner of her eye, she noted the way he seemed to curl slightly inward like a dog might if it were injured. She made a note not to let him get away without his own checkup. Bull was in today to get treated for an irregularity in his breathing. She had to commend her friend for noticing something that most people might not and for being concerned enough to bring the dog in. After a few tests, she determined it to be an allergic reaction to a certain kind of plant found only in the land of rivers. Seeing as the copy ninja and his summons had just spent 2 weeks in that area for a mission, it was easy to see where he might have come in contact with it. She prescribed him a special shampoo to wash out his fur with an easy-to-swallow diet until the swelling in his airways went down. Then she turned to a friend. "All right, your turn," she announced in the same tone she used to make her younger brother sit up straight and do as he was told. Kakashi blinked up at her with as innocent an expression as he could manage with his face mostly covered. It was surprisingly effective. She still knew better. "My turn. I can't imagine what you're—" "Kakashi, I can smell blood and it isn't Bull's," she interrupted him. "Not to mention the way you're favoring your right side. You're injured and avoiding the hospital. As usual." His eyes drifted slightly off to the side, a sure sign he was hiding something, as he murmured, "It isn't a big deal, Hana, it'll heal on its own." When she continued to stare him down silently, he widened his eye. "I promise if it gets infected, I'll get it looked at." Hana snorted in time with Natsuki. "No you won't," she disagreed. "Now get on the table." Kakashi avoided hospitals like the plague because he had trust issues. But he trusted her and he had let her fix him up on her exam table numerous times before. Her medical jutsu were aimed towards animal anatomy, so there was only so much she could do, but she would do it in a heartbeat if it meant he would accept some kind of treatment. "Really, I think I'll be okay," Kakashi hedged again. She eyed him suspiciously. "You're being cagey," she pointed out. "What is it about the wound that you don't want me to see?" Hana was absolutely fascinated to watch a blush spread out across the top of Kakashi's mask. They had been friends for a number of years now, and she could only remember seeing him blush maybe once before. He raised a hand to rub at the nape of his neck uncomfortably. "It's ha-ha, why would you know it's not done?" He stammered through a few more disconnected words while Hana looked on, more and more intrigued by the second, until finally he drooped his head like a puppy and mumbled something very quietly. His entire face was so red she was worried he might overheat. "Sorry, I didn't quite catch that," she said without mercy. "I said it's on my ass. I got a kunai in my ass." His hands both clamped down on his mouth and horror filled his eyes as he registered that he had just shouted that, probably loud enough for the receptionist girls to hear. Hana bit down on both of her lips and tried really she did not to laugh. It didn't work. Kakashi's pouting only made her laugh even harder until tears streamed down her cheeks. Bull and Natsuki, curled up together on the dog bed in the corner, had their heads buried in the soft material. Muffled canine chuckles could still be heard there. By the time Hana finally managed to pull herself together, her belly had started to hurt from the laughter. A few chuckles continued to escape as she used the collar of her white medical jacket to wipe the tears from her face. She couldn't remember the last time she laughed like that. She didn't even feel bad. Kakashi had been sitting on the floor earlier, so obviously it wasn't too bad, although she had seen the man walk home on a leg broken in 2 places. Still, a kunai in the ass. That was funny. She patted the exam table with one hand and tried for an apologetic face. "Okay, I'm sorry, Kakashi. But you should still get that looked at." She gave him a mischievous look. "I promise I won't tell anyone that I saw your tushy." Kakashi did rise from his chair, blush not entirely gone, but he still looked hesitant. His hand tugged at the hem of his vest in an adorable display of bashfulness. She knew better than a lot of people that Kakashi didn't cover up to look mysterious or cool. He covered as much of himself as possible because he was shy. "It's not just that," her friend mumbled even as he allowed her to lead him to the exam table by the arm. She raised an eyebrow. "It's right next to my soul mark." That's really private, you know. Comprehension dawned on her and Hannah gave him a sympathetic squeeze. She did know. Most people kept their soul marks private until they thought they had found the person it was meant for. Hannah was one of those people herself, although has presented a common problem, it was too generalized. The vague outline of what appeared to be a litter of pups on her ribs could be absolutely anyone in her clan. For her to see Kakashi's mark was an extremely intimate thing, but Hannah was of the opinion that health came before comfort zones. It is private, she agreed, but the one needs to be cared for. You know that. I'll try not to look too closely. I could get you something to hold over it. Kakashi mumbled under his breath that he was still going to have to show her his ass, but he did reach slowly for the button of his pants. Hannah smiled and fetched him a towel. How many girls in this village would give their right lung just to be able to see Kakashi bent over her medical table with his ass hanging out? Probably a good 3/4 of them. She tried not to smile as Kakashi faced away and slowly pulled the waist of his pants down, bringing his underwear down at the same time to reveal the palest bottom she had ever seen. His skin was almost as white as his hair, and the hard-on muscles in his butt had her wiping away a tiny bit of drool. Fighting to remain professional, she turned her eyes towards the ceiling until Kakashi had placed the towel over himself and then forced her gaze towards the windowed area. It looked as though he had barely dodged a flying kunai instead of being stabbed with it as she had assumed. The cut was about an inch long and it wasn't so deep that had to worry about hidden debris inside. However, it was obviously a couple days old and had not been properly cared for. Kakashi held still as she cleaned out the wound and stitched the two edges together. She knew only one basic healing jutsu that was safe to use on humans, and it did little more than lower the inflammation around the area, but she could see his muscles relaxing as her chakra seeped away the pain. When she had done all that she could, Hannah taped a bandage over the cut. If she spent a little bit more time than necessary making sure that the adhesive tape was properly applied, that was her own business. Kakashi had a fine ass and she had no qualms with taking her opportunities as they came. When she could draw it out no longer, Hannah couldn't resist a little teasing. All done, Kakashi. Shame. I was having fun. She accompanied her bold words with a friendly pat on the cloth-covered side of his ass, not quite prepared for the severity of his reaction. Kakashi yelped and jumped almost a foot off the ground, half turning around to look at her in shock. Then he realized that turning around would expose certain other parts of him, and he yelped again, both hands going forward to shield himself and snapping back around to face the table. The back of his neck was almost the exact shade of the clan markings on Hannah's face. Hannah, he protested, voice cracking in embarrassment. Hannah was not paying attention. She was staring at the soul mark suddenly revealed to her, the towel having dropped in his haste to cover himself. The muscles in his lower back jumped under her touch when she pressed a hand into him to stop him from moving. What are you doing? Kakashi, how closely have you looked at your soul mark? She asked in a faint voice. It's on my butt, I can't really see it. I know it's a dog. He was refusing to look at her, but his voice carried faint traces of curiosity. Why? Because that's my dog. What? That got his attention, encouraging him to actually turn his head and peer over his own shoulder as if he could see what she was talking about. What do you mean? Hannah found it difficult to breathe as she answered, I mean that your soul mark is a very detailed picture of Natsuki. With a bow on her head and everything. His eyes met hers over his shoulder and they blinked at each other for a few seconds. Can I put my pants back on? He asked plaintively. One quick giggle escaped against her will, but she nodded. Kakashi pulled his garments back into place and turned around fully only when he was comfortably covered up. He shifted his weight from side to side, rubbing the back of his head, before at last asking shyly, Can I ask what yours is? Hannah didn't even hesitate to pull open her coat and lift her shirt just far enough to reveal the vague mark that had frustrated her since she was old enough to know what it was for. Kakashi studied it in silence for a long time. She could see his eyes slowly rotating to look at each of the almost shapeless blobs, all of them a slightly different color and size. Those are my ninkan. What? Hannah struggled to see over the folds of her shirt without exposing the entirety of her chest. Show me. Kakashi pointed to each of the shapes, naming his ninken one by one. By the time he was done, she wondered how she could have missed it. The colors and size matched each of his dogs, and some of them were even identifiable by breed if you looked hard enough. Hana lifted her eyes and stared at Kakashi, who stared back. She couldn't seem to find the words to say anything. Kakashi had been one of her closest friends for years, so how could she never have given the idea any thought? How many years had she had a crush on him without even considering that he might be her soulmate? It was all too common for people to marry within their clan. She thought she was going to be one of them. Hana almost swallowed her tongue in surprise when Kakashi suddenly stepped forward and kissed her. He wasn't a man normally comfortable with physical contact, preferring to stay covered and safely inside his personal bubble. She was therefore doubly surprised when she discovered that he was a good kisser, even through the barrier of a mask. When they parted, she barely held in a protest. Surya was just happy. Kakashi mumbled, his eyes falling to the floor while he rubbed his head. He was just so shy. Hana wondered how everyone always got the impression that he was just being cool and suave. He was the most adorably awkward person she had ever met. And he was her soulmate. She wanted to squeal. Instead of responding to his unnecessary apology, Hana reeled him in for a second kiss. He made a delicious noise in the back of his throat, and she felt one of his gloved hands winding into her hair to cradle the back of her head. She was suddenly glad that his appointment had been the last of the day, because surely she wouldn't have been able to get anything else done after this discovery. "Oi. Break it up, you two," a growling voice complained from the corner of the room. "We don't want to see that." Hana and Kakashi both looked over to see Bull and Natsuki staring at them with suffering expressions. Before her companion could say anything, Hana scoffed and said, "Then don't look." Then she kissed him again, ignoring the howling from across the room. They would have to get used to it, after all. Chapter 13, Madara Tobarama, the one where your chest glows when your eyes meet. Version Oops. A gentle breeze ruffled the spiky locks on Madara's head as he walked through the forest, scuffing his heels with every step. His father was being stupid and Azuna was being annoying. He was glad to get away for a few hours of peace, even gladder that he had a friend waiting for him that wouldn't want to talk about how evil their rival clan, the Senju, were. Madara had heard quite enough about the Senju for one day, thank you very much. Scratching an itch on his chest, he looked up at the sky to check the position on the sun. It was almost noon, which meant that his friend Hashirama should be waiting at the river by now. Normally Madara was the first to arrive to their meeting place, but today he'd been held back by listening to his crotchety old man go on and on about rivalry and old forgotten insults. As if Madara cared. What his foolish parrot failed to see was that if they wanted the Senju to stop killing their clan members, the best way to do that was to make peace with them. If there was peace, the killings would stop. He hated that no one in his clan wanted to listen to his ideas. It was with relief that Madara stepped out of the trees to see the happily burbling river and the boy standing on the other side of it. Hashirama waved and jogged out onto the water, skipping stone held tightly in his fist. He had no idea what clan the clumsy boy was from, and it worked out better that way. It left the two of them free to dream of peace together without worrying about whether or not they would be expected to fight one day instead. "Madara, I found the perfect stun. I bet I beat you today." Between one step and the next, Hashirama suddenly pitched forward as he tripped over his own feet, arms flailing while he tried not to stumble into the river. The stone he was holding flew out of his grasp and disappeared under the water with a soft plunk. Madara rolled his eyes when Hashirama's whole body slumped in sadness. "Idiot," he muttered, trying not to show how amused he was. Just because he considered the brunette his best friend didn't mean he had to go all soft or anything. Hashirama pouted and shuffled over to him on the bank, toes digging through the rocks there in an effort to turn over another good one. It only took a couple of kicks before he was entirely absorbed in his new task, momentary depression forgotten. He was smiling once again when he looked up and opened his mouth, but the expression froze on his face, morphing into something else. "Madara, you're blowing," he chirped. Madara frowned and looked down at his chest. He slid a finger under the collar of his shirt and peered down inside. As his friend had said, a soft glow was emanating from the small tattoo on his chest, the one meant to lead him to his soulmate. The swirling design had always been red before. Right now it was lit up with white light that shone through his clothing just enough for Hashirama to notice. Madara stared at his tattoo in confusion. He had been meeting with Hashirama for months now, and it had never reacted before. So why was it lighting up now? The only thing he could think of was that there must be someone else nearby, someone that he couldn't see. With narrow eyes, Madara looked up and began to scan their surroundings. Even concentrating as hard as he could sense no one. At first he saw nothing as well until there. He froze in place when a spot of white moved among the branches of a tree on the opposite side of the river. Slowly, almost shyly, a small face peered around the trunk. He couldn't see them very well. They were too far away and still half hidden behind the tree. But they were looking directly at him in a manner that told him that he'd only seen them because they let themselves be seen. "We're not alone, Hashirama," Madara muttered out of the corner of his mouth. His friend stopped staring at the glow beneath his shirt, instead frowning in the direction he was looking. "Not alone. But I don't sense anyone. Unless Tobirama." Hashirama called out the name like he was taking a shot in the dark and hoping to hit the target. It was obvious he had guessed right when the face in the tree rolled their eyes and shifted, dropping down into full view. Tobirama. It was a boy only a couple of years younger than himself. He had white hair and extremely pale skin. His eyes were a deep red and his mouth set into a curious frown, which he directed first to the brunette boy approaching his with wide open arms. He neatly sidestepped the incoming hug, forcing Hashirama to catch himself before colliding spectacularly with a nearby boulder. "Tobirama!" Hashirama cried again. "What are you doing here?" The boy switched his blank gaze to Madara, who only then noticed the most important thing about this newcomer. There was a faint glow shining through his sleeveless shirt, limning the upper edges of it with white light. "Father asked me to follow you. He's getting suspicious." Both of his white eyebrows rose towards his hairline and a sarcastic expression settled onto his face. "He'll be happy to hear that you're spending some very boring days training alone by the river." Hashirama scrunched his face up in confusion as he said, "But I'm not alone. Madara's here so, I get it. You're the best brother ever, Tobirama." He tried for a hug again only for Tobirama to sidestep him a second time. Then he looked over at Madara, still on the far bank of the river. "You owe Uchiha Madara," he said. Madara blinked in surprise at the same time that Hashirama did. "I never told Hashirama my clan name," he mused. "How did you know it?" The boy scoffed. "I have eyes and they work," was the scornful reply. Hashirama gave a whining protest about mean brothers that went ignored. "My name is Senju Tobirama." Madara felt his limbs stiffen. He had suspected, of course, that his river friend might be from the one clan his own hated more than all others. He had hoped not. Apparently his hopes were in vain. Both of the brothers were watching him closely to see how he would react, but Madara took his time to mull this information over. On the one hand, loyalty to his clan demanded that he denounce these two boys and attack them. On the other hand, neither of them had ever caused him any harm, and all signs pointed to one of them being his soulmate. That thought brought all others to a halt. His soulmate was a Senju. Instead of feeling horrified, Madara was filled with a sudden hope. This was the answer to his problems, handed right to him on a silver platter. His clan venerated the bonds of love over all other things, and his soulmate was a Senju. He could use this to end the fighting. Surely his parents would not force him to fight the one he was fated to be with. A wolfish grin spread slowly across his face, and Madara took the first few steps out onto the water, plans already forming in his mind. The younger boy walked out to meet him. To Madara's delight, he looked far from afraid. "It's nice to meet you," Madara told the boy with a surprising amount of sincerity. Tobirama smirked and held out his hand. When they grasped each other for the first time, the light show that triggered from their chests was like something out of legends. Madara had never seen a bond meeting with so much potential. Thoughts of advantages and plots fell away from his mind as he watched the flares of brilliant white and gold. Suddenly, he was excited to fall in love. Version correct. Madara hated to admit when the elders were right. The wizened old windbags were a thorn in his young side, and he enjoyed proving them wrong on every possible occasion. This time, however, he had to admit that they were entirely correct. Not that he had to let them know that. As the heir to the Uchiha main house, Madara was subject to lessons from the clan elders at least once a week. The lessons were different from his usual training in weapons, speed, espionage, and all the exciting parts of being a shinobi. These were instead meant to pass on the wisdom and life lessons of those who came before him, that he might use their example to lead their family into a brighter future. Madara was of the personal opinion that they just wanted someone to drone at who couldn't run away. This week's lesson had been about maintaining relations between clans that they were allied with and how to phrase his speech more diplomatically. It was a skill he struggled with. As they were wont to do, the group of old fogies had managed to get themselves off onto a few tangents, and somehow they ended up discussing soul bonds. Soul bonds were common knowledge. Every child knew they existed, even if not every child always found theirs. Madara had always looked forward to meeting his, eager to meet the person whose soul had been bound to his through multiple incarnations. It was said that one soul would not reincarnate until their bond pair was ready to do so as well, so that they might meet and fall in love again. A bond pair was always fated to love again, no matter if they were new faces and new names. Their souls would always recognize each other. Not everyone has a bond, however. Elder Tomiko's voice was broken and warbling with age, and the set of her mouth was full of pity for the idea. Those that have no bond feel no connection to any other. They are the younger souls that have seen fewer incarnations, still searching for that perfect match. Ideally, you would have been a new soul. It is preferable for a political marriage. Here her mouth turned up in a slightly softer expression as she told him, but those that do have a match know it. There is a feeling, a pull, deep in your chest. It is the feeling of your soul reaching out, desperately searching for its other half. Elder Tomiko shared a secret glance with her husband, seated beside her, as Madara considered her words. He hated to admit it, but she was right. Many a night he had lain awake in his bed, trying to determine which direction his soulmate was in. Most often he fancied that the pull came from the east. It took a great deal of willpower to swallow his pride and asked for their help, but this was something too important to leave things to chance. "How will I know that I found them?" he asked begrudgingly. The eyes of every old fogey in the room focused on him with smiles that he couldn't help but feel were laced with light poison. "When you look into there as my boy," Elder Tomiko leaned towards him with a secretive look, "you'll just know." Madara really hated it when they were right. A year after that he had met a boy on a riverbank who went by the name of Hashirama. Hashirama had terrible hair and a disposition that flicked from puppy-like enthusiasm to melodramatic depression at the drop of a hat. The two of them built a friendship on shared dreams of peace, and it felt good to have someone he connected to on levels he'd never been able to with anyone in his own clan. Life was pleasant that summer, filled with laughter and bright ideas for the future. That is, until the day Azuna followed him to see where his big brother cat disappearing for hours at a time. His sibling had run straight to his father, who was immediately suspicious. Madara didn't want to betray his friend, but he had no choice in obeying his father when the man made clear his intentions. So the next time he went to meet Hashirama, Madara tried to warn the boy, tried to make him run. When the stone that skipped across the river into his hand bore a similar message as his own, he knew his life was about to change. It was the manner of the change that he did not suspect. As his father and brother burst from the trees, so did Hashirama's. The four enemies settled on the surface of the river, staring each other down, and Madara looked up to assess the two that opposed his family. But Suma he had seen before. The man was a brute savage with no more feeling in his heart than a stone. He turned his gaze to the other. The boy beside him was slight and young. His hair was white like fresh snow, and his eyes. Madara felt fate as his entire world appeared to rearrange itself. Those eyes. They were as red as any Sharingan with pupils in place of Toma. Looking at them from across the river, just as his elder had told him he would, Madara knew. This was his soulmate, the other half of himself, the one he was meant to be with. He was a Senju. Izuna identified the boy as Tobirama, and Madara scored the name into the silence of his heart. When he and Hashirama leapt in front of the blades of their families, he tried to catch the eye of the youngest Senju. The boy stared past him, over his shoulder, and did not even attempt to meet his gaze. Desperate to go and avoid any bloodshed, Madara told his father the one thing that would make him leave, that Hashirama was stronger than himself. It was a thing he would never have admitted. To obviously admit to being the lesser, and of a Senju at that, was entirely against his personality. Yet his father had never paid enough attention to him to take note of that sort of thing. He took it as fact, and Madara got what he wanted. Sort of. He had wanted to know who his soul was bonded to, and now he did. Now all he wanted was to run away and hide until things made sense. How could they love with so much hate between their clans? How could they be together with so much distance between them? Traveling back to his family compound, his brother and father's angry mutters piercing his ears, Madara reflected that the events of today had only increased his desire for peace. Suddenly, his dream shifted. Before, he had wanted a world where he could protect his little brother. Now his vision of the future had changed toward the figure of a small pale boy standing at his side with nothing to keep them apart. Years passed before Madara saw the boy again. When they did meet, it was on the battlefield. In the moments between trading blows with Hashirama, he snuck glances behind the brunette to where their younger siblings were locked in a similar battle. That gangly young boy had grown into a fine young man. He was 17 now to Madara's 19, and he commanded the field like the force of nature he was. The armor he wore was blue with fur around his shoulders. His white hair was held back by a Hapira star face protector, allowing glimpses of the 3 lines of red he now had tattooed onto his skin. It was hard to see the exact shape of him under the thick plates of armor, but he was tall and lean and as fast as the wind over the desert. He was the most beautiful creature Madara had ever seen. The clash between their clans that day ended in a draw. As their fathers traded insults, Hashirama tried to catch his gaze. Instead of indulging the boy he had once been friends with, Madara turned his attention instead to Tobirama. The young man stood with his feet apart and his arms crossed, chin held high. It seemed a natural pose for him. His red eyes swept slowly back and forth, yet never did they meet with Madara's, much to his displeasure. They parted ways, both sides carding their dead kin, and he seethed inside. The years had done nothing but drive the 2 clans farther and farther apart. He wanted peace. But he had yet to think of a way to achieve that. Only when he had laid his head down on his pillow that night did it come to him. His father was old. His sword arm had been slowed by time just as much as Senju Butsuma's had. Their time was ending. Which meant that soon it would be time for the next generation to take over. Within a few years he would be head of the Uchiha clan, and Hashirama would take his place as the head of the Senju clan. He knew very well that Hashirama would not have given up on peace, it simply wasn't his way. When the time came, Hashirama would be the one to hold up the olive branch both of their clans so desperately needed. Madara intended to take it. That time came even sooner than he had anticipated. It was only 3 years later when Madara's father succumbed to a sickness he had picked up on a mission, passing away quietly in the night rather than bloody and angry on a battlefield. Some in the clan whispered how wasted his death had been. Madara was of the opinion that it was all the same. Death was death, no matter how it had happened. His father was gone from this world, leaving him as the head of the Uchiha clan. Only 1 year after that saw Senju Butsuma's fall in battle. Ironically, not a single Uchiha was present. He had fallen in a skirmish with the Shimura clan to the north. When next the Uchiha and Senju faced each other on the battlefield, Hashirama held out his hand. Smiling, Madara took it. He ignored the rumbling of discontent from the elders in his ranks and relished in the cheers of the younger clansmen instead. Perhaps our wild dreams of a peaceful village might not be so out of reach, Hashirama said to him over the noise. Madara smirked in agreement as his old friend spread his arms wide. Let there be peace between the heads of our 2 clans. Let the rest follow our example and lay down their arms. Madara didn't bother looking over when Azuna stepped up beside him. He was busy watching Tobirama as he came to stand next to his own brother, warily eyeing the one he had met in battle countless times before. Good thing too, Azuna was saying with a grin while they shook hands. I know that look in your eye, Senju. You've got something up your sleeve today. I rather think this is the day you might have finally beaten me. Doubtless, was all Tobirama said. He was cocky and gruff, and Madara was already in love. He had been for years. He held out a hand to the one he had been dreaming of since that day by the river, waiting while the pale man turned to inspect it. Then he looked up, and at long last, though it had taken many years, their eyes met for the very first time. Tobirama's eyes widened in astonishment as both of their chests began to emit brilliant light, drawing the attention of every person present from both clans. Shocked exclamations rang out from all around them. Madara held tighter to the hand in his grasp and began to laugh. He laughed loud and long, until he could feel Tobirama glaring at him. Finally, he declared. His soulmate raised a confused eyebrow. "I've been waiting for you for years, you dunderhead. Took you long enough." The dumbfounded expression on the younger man's face was almost worth the years it had taken to get them here. The truest rewards, however, was still to come. Chapter 14, Hinata Boc, the one where you can hear your soulmate singing. The night air was cold in Kumodakure. The common town called it the village hidden in the clouds, and it was easy to tell why. The after-dark hours brought with them a thick fog that obscured everything more than a few feet in front of one's eyes. Only a native of the land could successfully navigate Kumodakure's treacherous landscape in the darkness. Hinata was not a native of this village. What she was terrified. Cloud Shinobi had made their first attempt at kidnapping her when she was 3 years old. Her father had saved her then, and she had thought that he was the strongest shinobi in the entire world, that he would protect her from everything forever. Now she was 9 years old and her father had been away on a mission, resulting in a successful second attempt. A thick leather band had been placed around her eyes, tight enough that she could not lift the lids to uncover her developing Byakugan. She didn't see the fog. She couldn't tell that it was night. She had no idea where she was except for the name of the village, overheard from a careless guard. The cage they carried her in was wooden and uncomfortable. Her knees were full of splinters from kneeling on the floor of it, tossed about at every sharp change of direction. Hinata sniffed and huddled farther into a corner, humming quietly under her breath. It was a song she had never heard out loud, but it was one that never failed to bring her comfort. She had only completed 2 bars of the soothing melody when, deep in her mind, another voice rose in harmony with her own. Across the vast distance between them, her soulmate reached out to comfort her in the only way they could. It was her soulmate that had first taught her this tune. Hinata had no idea who they were or where they might be. The only connection she had was a voice in her head, and the only time she heard their voice was when they sang. Hearing them now in the back of her mind kept her calm enough that her sobs were quieted. She had tried to beg for freedom for the first few days of the journey. All her pleas had earned her was a few slaps around the mouth and the withholding of food or water. Hinata's stomach growled as she thought about how empty it was. Trying to ignore the feeling, she risked humming just a little longer, desperately hoping no one heard her. Her song cut off when her bearers came to a sudden stop, jerking her off balance and causing her to tumble across the cage. A few tears gathered in her eyes, unable to fall, and she tried hard not to whimper in pain. Her father always told her she needed to be braver, stronger, better. It was just hard to be brave when she was so frightened. She'd never felt so alone in her life. "Is that her? Bring her here." The voice that spoke came from her right side. It was androgynous and angry, growling and snapping at her bearers to move faster. Hinata found herself being bodily dragged from her mobile prison and carried a short distance. When they put her down, her knees tried to buckle, swollen from staying bent for days on end. The floor under her feet was cold, rough stone. A thick hand held her upright, forcing her to stand and eliciting another unwanted whimper. "Pluck up, girlie, the rake's away right now. You get to live at least until he comes back." More tears gathered and more pain flared through her legs as Hinata felt herself being led away. They walked for a long time. Doors opened and closed, footsteps passed them, and voices jeered from near and afar. The floor never changed from stone, although in some places it was smooth and others it wasn't. When at last she heard keys rattling and the man holding her left arm muttered, "Here we are," they were in a place where the stone was at its roughest. Hinata gasped as she stumbled forward, a hand having shoved her hard between the shoulder blades. Mocking laughter trailed away as her captors left. She heard a cell door close, then silence. The Hyuga era stood alone, blind and confused, terrified and in pain, unsure of where she was or how long she had left to live. Once more a single whimper escaped where the tears could not as she held her hands out into the empty space around her. Her feet shuffled as she inched forward, searching for a wall, a bed, the door, anything. After a few minutes her fingertips brushed up against what felt like a dirt wall. She followed it until she came to a corner where dirt wall met with metal bars. There she slid down to the floor, hugged her arms around herself, and began to hum. The soft melody of her favorite song echoed slightly, rebounding back to her from the corners of wherever she was. It gave the impression of several voices singing with her, which is why it took a moment for her to realize that someone really was Some were close to her rider's soft voice lifted, singing the notes instead of humming them. Hinata went quiet with wonder as the voice drifted closer to her. It was pleasing to listen to, surely, but her wonder came from the fact that she could also hear it inside of her mind. She startled when a hand gently stroked her dirty hair. "Hello, precious one," she heard someone say. "I'm so happy to meet you. What's your name?" Hinata reached up shyly to touch the other girl's wrist. "Hinata," she whispered shyly. A pretty little laugh graced her ears. "Well then, hello Hinata. My name is Yuika. Don't you worry, I'll make sure we are not here for long. For now, let's get that contraction off of your head." Hinata sat still as hands fiddled with the locking mechanism that she couldn't see to undo for herself. It took a few minutes before finally it gave way and the leather band loosened. When it was pulled off of her, she blinked into the dim light, taking in her surroundings. They were in a large room with metal bars breaking two of the walls up into separate cells. Just on the other side of the bars of her own cell sat a pretty girl about her own age with long hair a deep shade of blue and eyes the color of the sky. When she smiled, it revealed that one of her front teeth had fallen out and was in the process of regrowing. "You have such pretty eyes," Yuika chirped. Hinata felt the heat rising in her face and poked the ends of her fingers together shyly. Thank you," she murmured, staring at her feet. Her gaze rose back up with Yuika reached over and placed her hand over Hinata's own. "When we are free, let's never be apart," she said. Hinata smiled and nodded. That sounded wonderful to her. Chapter 15, Obito Kakashi, the one where you have a compass in your wrist. Obito was pretty sure his compass was broken. It wasn't that it moved too much. Surely someone coming and going during their day would make the needle flip back and forth while they traveled from home to school or work. No, Obito's problem was that his compass didn't move enough. Only once every few months it would change direction. His needle would point east for 4 months before flipping to west for 3. Then it would point southwest for a few before changing again, and so on and so forth. It had been doing this ever since he was 5 years old, and more than a few of his classmates made fun of him for it, especially as they moved into their high school years. They liked to say that he had no soulmate. Sometimes Obito believed them. It was hard not to, after all. Obito was an orphan being raised by a distant relative who had absolutely no interest in him. He was a hyperactive boy with low grades, and his only friends were the old ladies at the old folks' home where he volunteered. He had an odd propensity for wearing orange and was never seen without a pair of thick goggles on his head. At 16 years old, Obito had started to agree with the people who teased him. Who would want a loser like him as their soulmate? Walking home from Konoha High, Obito kicked at the stones on the sidewalk beneath him, wondering if Uncle Madara would even notice if he didn't come home. The man spent so much time with his head in his work it was a wonder he usually remembered to feed his ward. Obito lifted his right arm and tapped a finger on the compass implanted in his wrist. It was pointing in the same direction he was walking, due west. That was a little strange considering that it had only stayed at its previous direction, southwest, for 2 weeks. Before that it had pointed south for 4 months. There were people standing on the sidewalk, chatting and lurking outside one of the houses, but he walked right past them without raising his head. He mused that perhaps the needle was going to start moving gradually faster until it reached the point that it simply spun in endless circles. The thought had only just finished when suddenly it did, in fact, move again. As he watched, the compass slowly slid around until it was pointing directly behind him. Obito stopped walking, flabbergasted. It had never moved quite like that before. Usually the changes in direction took hours, the needle slowly crawling from one cardinal direction to another. Fascinated, Obito wondered if he could make it do it again by retracing his steps. Turning around, he headed back up the sidewalk the way he had just come. As he passed by the people chatting on the pavement again, the needle slowly shifted in his wrist, pointing directly at the spot they were standing on. Now, Obito had thought his compass broken for so many years that he could almost be forgiven for being so slow in this instance. It took walking past those people 2 more times before he realized what this must mean. When he did, his head snapped up with such force that his neck gave a painful twinge. He ignored it in favor of staring hard at the people there on the sidewalk. An enormously tall man with long white hair was talking to, of all people, Obito's sociology teacher Namikaze Minado. His blonde teacher was smiling while one of his arms wrapped around the shoulders of a grumpy-looking teenager. The teen's hair was white and unruly and his face was buried in the unseasonal green scarf around his neck. His dark eyes were glaring at the ground and his arm were folded across his chest, short sleeves showing off the definition of his biceps. Obito stared some more while his ears finally tuned into the conversation. "I'm sure it wasn't that bad," Namikaze-san was saying, humor in his voice. The teenager snorted. "Oh come on, Kakashi. I thought you liked traveling with me. I introduced you to so many girls." The tall man was obviously using a wheedling tone to cover up his amusement. The teen, Kakashi apparently, glared up at him. Despite the younger being quite tall, he still had to crane his head to meet his elder's eyes. "You're the one that likes girls, you pervert," he declared. Both of the adults laughed. "Ah, Kakashi," Namikaze-sen coughed delicately, untightening its grip. "I think you're forgetting that we both know you have one of Jiraiya-sensei's novels in your back pocket." Obito watched the young man huff and bury his face deeper into his scarf, muttering indistinctly under his breath. He didn't seem to enjoy the teasing he was obviously receiving. Obito wondered what about the book in his back pocket made him a pervert. How could a book make someone a pervert? He was distracted from wondering when the one he was watching suddenly raised his eyes and looked right at him. Pale eyebrows furrowed in a petulant frown. "Did you need something?" the young man asked him. "Or did you want to walk by 3 more times?" Obito spluttered a bit, incredibly nervous. "It's my compass was being weird, sorry." He could feel his face warming up as all 3 of them looked at him curiously. After a beat of surprise, his sociology teacher smiled welcomingly. "Obito, I didn't see you there. What were you saying about your compass?" Obito swallowed nervously, eyes flicking between his teacher and the teen wrapped under his arm. "Ah, it usually doesn't move. Like, only once every few months. But it keeps pointing at where you guys are standing and I just thought I could go. If you want." He felt a little like shrieking into himself. Hope had filled him when the idea first occurred, but now he was starting to rethink himself. The boy across from him was tall, well-built, and gorgeous. Obito was small and plain and scrawny. What would this guy want with him? Even if they were. He squawked in surprise when the huge man suddenly bounded over and grabbed him by the arm, pulling him closer to their little gathering. His right arm was pulled up and stretched out, then turned over to display the compass in his wrist. As he had said, the needle was pointing directly at this Kakashi guy. "Only moves once every few months, eh?" The one who grabbed him chuckled good-naturedly. "Almost as if it's been following someone that travels to a new location every few months." Obito had never thought of that. He wondered how he could have never thought of that. It would explain why the changes in direction took hours to complete. Plane rides. Car rides. Kakashi stared at the compass for a few more seconds before uncrossing his arms and holding up his arm. His needle was pointing straight at Obito. With a contemplative hum, the boy walked slowly in a full circle around their little group, eyes on his own wrist the whole time. Obito wished he could see what the other's compass was doing, but the giant man still had a hand on his arm. Finally he came to a stop right in front of Obito and held his gaze, face still buried in his scarf. Just above its edge a tiny flash of pig peeked out. "Hi," the boy mumbled. "My name's Kakashi." "Oh, Obito," he replied nervously. "It looks like we are soulmates." The teen ignored the way both of the adults with him suddenly set off into paroxysms of joy, cheering and whooping. Obito felt his jaw drop. "A soulmate, wow. I've really got a soulmate. You really want me?" Something was expanding in his chest, and if he wasn't mistaken, it felt like genuine happiness. It felt like possibilities. Dark eyes widened in surprise. "Why wouldn't I want you?" That one question, so innocently asked, absolutely broke him down. With a strangled sob, Obito threw his arms around Kakashi and held on to him for dear life. He couldn't answer his confused questions, only cried even harder when strong arms wrapped around him and pulled him closer. He couldn't remember ever being so happy before. Kakashi, he learned later, was an orphan just like him. His godfather was the monstrously tall man named Jiraiya. Jiraiya was an author, and the two of them had traveled all over while he searched for inspiration for his writing, moving to a different location every few months or whenever the wanderlust took them. Since Kakashi was getting into his last years of high school, they had decided he should come live with an old family friend so he could stay with him while he went through college. "Come on inside, this is your home too now, of course," Namikaze-san had said to him, unable to understand why he had immediately started to cry again. For most of his life, Obito had believed his compass was broken. He had thought he would spend his life alone and unwanted. Now, he finally had a place where he was wanted. He finally had a place where he belonged. Chapter 16, Sakura Itachi, the one where you go colorblind when you meet your soulmate. Sakura met Itachi once when she was very young. She hadn't meant to get lost in the woods, especially when her parents had told her time and time again not to go off on her own. But the other children had been teasing her about her forehead again, and Sakura had wanted to get away from them. She had been crying when someone dropped out of the trees and landed right in front of her, startling her into giving out a high-pitched screech. The boy had his ANBU mask clipped to his belt and a somber expression in his face. He looked like he was just getting into his adolescent years. When their eyes had met, all of the color in the world around them slowly started to fade until all she was left with was shades of gray. The boy looked just as startled as she felt. "Hello there, what's your name?" he had asked. She gave him a confused smile. "Sakura." Her head tilted to the side. "Where did all the colors go?" "That's a pretty name." "My name is Itachi." He frowned. "Didn't your parents tell you about the colors?" She shook her head, looking around at all the flowers, and said, "No. They don't tell me anything. Papa says I'm too young to understand." She was almost glad that none of the flowers had any color anymore. At least now she wouldn't have to worry about which ones looked good with her hair and which ones didn't. They all looked mostly the same to her now. The ANBU boy sighed, looking suddenly sad. He bent down and picked a flower, slowly leaning over to place it in her hand. "I'm so sorry, Sakura," he told her in a quiet voice. "I'm so sorry that this doesn't change anything." She hadn't known what he meant at the time, and he left before she could demand an explanation of him. The next morning there was panic in the village as the Uchiha compound was discovered, bodies littered everywhere. Uchiha Itachi had gone mad, people said. He slaughtered his entire clan except for his younger brother. Sakura heard the whispers and curled up in her bed to cry. Her parents had explained to her last night about the colors. Itachi was her soulmate. Itachi was a murderer. Sakura put a lot of effort into becoming a shinobi after that. She wanted to be the kind of person who was strong enough to protect others, to prevent what had happened that day from happening again. She wanted no other little girls to go through the pain she had. Itachi's younger brother was Sasuke, that cool boy in her class that everyone loved. Sakura convinced herself that she loved him too. Not because he had a winning personality or a gentle disposition, he had neither of those things. Sakura wanted to be with Sasuke because he was both the farthest thing from Itachi and the closest thing to Itachi. He was her soulmate's brother, yet she liked to think that they were entirely dissimilar. She promised herself that she would follow Sasuke to the ends of the earth and back and prove that soulmates weren't everything. Sakura met Itachi again when she was 16 years old, only months away from turning 17. She had indeed devoted much of her life to chasing Sasuke. Only this time it had led her to a battle between brothers, a titanic clash between powerhouses that she could only stand back and observe with awe. The jutsu used were on a scale she hadn't seen before. This was the power of the Uchiha clan that she had never had the privilege to witness. From afar she watched Sasuke and Itachi crash into each other again and again. Blood spilled from both of them and she was torn between whose life to hope for. She had spent years nurturing a bond with Sasuke, and yet her heart still beat for Itachi in some small, forgotten way. She felt as frightened as she had that day in the woods so long ago. As far back from the battle as she was, Sakura never saw the killing blow. She never saw the light fading from dark Uchiha eyes. What she did see was color bleeding back into the world. The trees were as green as she remembered, and the sky was a stunning shade of blue. The strands of her hair that swayed in front of her eyes were a light bubblegum shade of pink that she had almost entirely forgotten. The world around her lit up with beauty, and Sakura began to cry. Chapter 17, Kakashi, Shisui, the one where you know them by touch. He is exhausted and dirty and one jutsu away from chakra exhaustion when he finds the body. It lays face up at the curve of the river which runs from a waterfall only a short distance outside of Konoha. It's obvious that the young man has gone down the falls. It's even more obvious that he had been the victim of an attack before doing so. The sockets where his eyes should be are bloody and empty, lids falling concave inwards. His dark hair fans out in the water that is gently rocking him against the shoreline, a curly halo of ink. By his face it would be obvious that he is an Uchiha even if Kakashi had never heard of Shisui. They have never met directly, but tales of the fair-minded smiling Uchiha have reached him even behind his porcelain mask. He thinks the boy dead at first, feels anger that a Konoha shinobi died so close to home with no one there to help him. That is, until he stumbles closer on knees weak from a 3-day journey with no rest. The sound of his feet crunching on the gravel is loud compared to the silence, and suddenly the body twitches. The head lolls slowly to the side, unable to see him, and the lips part with no sound. Kakashi falls to his knees beside the boy, reaching into the water to grasp his clothing and pull him out as gently as he can. Shisui, right? Can you hear me, Shisui? He asks. The boy mumbles and attempts to reach out. It's surprising that he is alive right now. It's downright impressive that he can move at all. Kakashi removes the mask of the hound to reveal the Konoha headband tied on underneath. He usually doesn't wear it while in ANBU dress, but his current level of exhaustion means he needs to be sure the Sharingan will stay closed. I'm a Konoha shinobi, he reassures, grasping Shisui's sleeve-covered arm and lifting that wet hand up to the headband he wears. Shisui's fingers trace the stylized leaf symbol. When he recognizes it by touch, he lets out a desperate sob and his fingers drag downward to clutch at Kakashi's face. Immediately both of them freeze. It's been a long day for both of them, to use the biggest understatement possible, but not even near death can ruin the peaceful, beautiful moment when you finally find your soulmate. Kakashi runs his hand up the arm under his grip to press against the hand on his face. His throat is tight and every organ inside his chest hurts like fire. It's going to be all right, Shisui. I'll bring you home. I'll keep you safe. The boy whimpers as Kakashi worms tired arms under his body and lifts. He cradles Shisui to his chest and has a quick mental talk with his lens. Now is not the time to give up or give out. If ever before he has needed his body to push onward, it is now. His knees scream as they bear the weight of 2, but they hold solid while he races through the treetops. Please, Danzo, my people, Kakashi holds him closer so that Shisui can choke out his story in fitful whispers. Kakashi learns of a plot to erase the entire Uchiha clan, to cleanse them from the village entirely in an attempt to prevent an unstoppable coup. He tries to run faster. In the end, Kakashi does not make it in time to save the Uchiha clan. He does make it to the village in time to save the life of his soulmate. It is only after the teen has been taken from his arms and carted away for emergency surgery that he realizes he never gave his own name. Shisui had trusted him not knowing who he was, only what he was. He stands staring at the doors to the surgery bay until the effects of adrenaline wear away. Darkness creeps in at the edges of his vision and Kakashi passes out with the worried shouts of the receptionist in his ear. He wakes up in a soft bed 8 days later and the nurses are excited to tell him the news. Shisui's story has spread throughout the village like wildfire. Danzo is under house arrest for coercing Itachi to commit the crime that the Sandaime had not truly given his approval for. Itachi has been found and returned to the village, currently held in an interrogation cell. The villagers view him with varied opinions. Some see him as a monster. Some believe him a poor misguided child who was only following orders. Kakashi's interest lies with the fact that Itachi returned bearing one of Shisui's eyes, held in safekeeping. The other has been retrieved from Danzo's disgusting arm. Upon learning that Shisui regained consciousness 2 days before, he demands to know where he can find the boy. Shisui still has bandages around his face when Kakashi steps into the room. He turns his head upon sensing someone there, tilting it bird-like to the side in a silent question. Kakashi makes sure that every footfall is audible as he slowly approaches the bed. "I hear you're feeling better," he says in place of a greeting. It's astonishing to watch the younger boy's face light up just for hearing his voice. "Kakashi, you're awake. They wouldn't let me visit you." He reaches out a hand. Kakashi hesitates only briefly before taking it, slipping Shisue's fingers into his palm and wrapping them up in a tight hold. It feels like safety and protection. How did you know who I am? He asks. The nurse had said that the returned eyes would take a little while longer to heal back into place. Surely he can't see through the bandages. Shisue's smile is open and honest, and it's the warmest look he's ever been given. The doctors told me who brought me to the hospital. They told me you were in pretty bad condition yourself. He lifts his other hand, reaching across his body and feeling along Kakashi's arm and up until he cups his cheek gently. Thank you for taking care of me. Kakashi's smile is a little unsteady and is glad, for a moment, that he remains unsane. Of course, he whispers, turning his face until his lips are pressed against Chisua's palm. Always. The hand holding his tightens its grip. It feels like possibilities. Chapter 18, The Bruise of Haku, the one when marks on your soulmate's body show up on your own. It took a while for Zabuza to put two and two together. He had seen the marks appearing and fading on his body, had gotten used to them shortly before he had met the boy. He thought little of them until the pattern was made clear by a spontaneous stop at a cheap hot springs. He paid as little attention to Haku as possible normally. The boy was an extension of his blade, nothing more. That changed when he saw the bruises on his torso, marks of the hard training he was committed to doing every day. Zabuza plodded each one, unable to believe his eyes. They matched the marks on himself perfectly. Every bruise and cut, every scar. They all lined up exactly with his own, which could only mean one thing. Later, after leaving Haku to bath alone and giving himself time to think, he joined his ward in their rooms for dinner. The silence stretched at first as he tried to think of what to say. Haku seemed oblivious to his tension at first, picking at his meal delicately and with his usual calm air of contentment. When their plates were half cleared, Zabuza cleared his throat, fiddling with the blade sheathed at his hip. Haku, I want to show you something, he growled. He couldn't help but be gruff. He was not an expert at defining his own emotions, and it was easier to snap and snarl than it was to look too closely at his own heart. Haku smiled up at him. Of course, Zabuza, he answered obediently. Zabuza frowned. He would need to address that later. What he had discovered changed things between them. Hold out your hand. His blunt demand was complied with without question. Haku raised his hand and held it out over the table between them. Zabuza held his own large hand right next to it. His other brought up the blade he had been playing with, drawing it slowly across his knuckles. Blood welled up and ran down between his fingers, dripping into the food. At the same time, a line of red bloomed across Haku's knuckles to match. The boy marveled at his newest mark. As soon as the significance of this phenomena occurred to him, he looked up at his guardian with wonder in his eyes. Zabuza retracted his hand and took a deep breath. With difficulty he said, when we met, you told me you were only an instrument of my will. You asked me to think of you as a weapon to keep at my side and use only as I see fit. Yes, Zabuza, Haku breathed. Zabuza drew his brows together sternly. That is no longer the case, he declared. This makes things different. You are more than my will. You are. He struggled to find what he wanted to say. Innocent eyes peered up at him, the eyes of a boy that barely seemed to understand the massive power he wielded, but wielded it anyway on the command of the one he had given his life to. You are my partner, he decided at last. He thought Haku was going to cry for a few moments and prayed against it. Crying wasn't something he was equipped to handle. Softness simply wasn't his way. Somehow he had managed to earn himself a soulmate who not only understood that but accepted him for it, just the way he was. He'd never done anything in his life to earn the loyalty of this small person, nor his love. A part of him felt guilty that it had so easily been handed to him even still. May I hug you, Zabuza? The question startled him. He had told Haku the day they met not to expect affection from him, and the boy had respected that boundary. Outside of sparring, they rarely even sat close to each other. The corner of his mouth twitched upwards. Maybe just this once, he acceded. Haku's joyful expression as he flung his small body across Zabuza's lap absolutely did not fill him with warmth. Or so he tried to tell himself. Chapter 19, Hanabi Emoji, the one where your eyes change color. Having one eye that matched your soulmates was strange when one was born with a jutsu. It acted the same as a biocuban eye would. Her vision was the same through both eyes when activated, and the abilities were never compromised. What was strange was seeing the pupil-less eyes of her family and clan mates, then looking into the mirror and being startled by the jewel dark rings on the white orb that sat in her right eye socket. Whoever his soulmate was, their iris was only a few shades lighter than their pupil. Hanabi had lived her entire young life inside the Hyuda compound, so the idea of pupils being normal was entirely foreign to her. When she had started to realize she was different, she had at first thought that her soulmate was a freak. It wasn't until one evening when the Hokage came to speak to her father that she realized others might have pupils too. The man's eyes had scared her at first. The dark beady centers seemed to focus on her much too pointedly, pinning her in place. Her father had reprimanded her for being afraid, but the Hokage only laughed and invited her to have a closer look. Little 4-year-old Hanabi had held her hands behind her back and leaned close to the old man bent over before her, inspecting him with an air of seriousness attainable only by a Hyuda. "You have eyes like one of mine," she informed him, as if he couldn't see that for himself. "That means my soulmate will have funny eyes like you." "Do you know who my soulmate is, Hokage-sama?" The old man had only chuckled once more and told her to be patient, that there were more people than she realized with eyes like his. Her father had allowed her outside the compound for the first time shortly after that, and she had been shocked to see how true that was. Her soulmate wasn't a freak. It was her clan that was special. No one else seemed to have eyes quite the same as the Hyuda. That would definitely make finding her soulmate harder than she had thought at first. When Hanabi was 8, she entered the academy. She'd heard that in the past special children were allowed to enter early and wished that was still true. She had been training hard since she learned to walk and was fairly sure she could toss around any one of her classmates. She got the chance to test that theory almost right away when she entered the almost empty classroom to see 2 boys picking on a girl couched in the corner. They were jeering and pulling her bright orange pigtails. Neither of the boys saw Hanabi's fist coming, but they certainly felt it if the way they wheezed and fell down between the desks was any indication. Hanabi scoffed at them and turned to the girl, still huddled with her head between her knees. "Did they hurt you?" she asked. If the girl was injured, she was obviously still in good enough shape to walk to a medic herself. Hanabi just wanted to know if she should hit the 2 boys a second time. She wasn't a big fan of weak people herself, but if there was one lesson she had managed to pick up from watching her older sister, it was that picking on those who were weaker than you was cruel and pointless. She may have lost much of her respect for Hanada, but that didn't mean she would let someone bully her. The orange-haired girl sniffed and lifted her head, wiping at her face with the back of one fist. When she looked up, Hanabi had only a few seconds to register that one of the girl's eyes was a pale flat lavender before it slowly faded away to become a matching set of dark pupils. She gaped in an undignified manner, at first more surprised than happy. The spell was broken when the girl scrambled to her feet and threw her thin arms around Hanabi's neck. "I found you. I found you," she was shouting. Hanabi slowly raised her arms and held on until the hug was over. For some reason, the only thing she could think of was that her eyes would be matching now, which meant that she would no longer be carrying around a piece of her soulmate with her. "My name is Hanabi," she said. "What's yours?" "Modi," was the answer. Hanabi pulled her soulmate back into her arms. "I see. Modi. Stay close to me always, Modi." The girl gave her a quick startled look before squealing and snuggling into her. Hanabi only smiled and thought, so this is what it feels like to be whole. Chapter 20, Gara Diadara, the one where your soulmate haunts you after death. "What are you doing now, Yuen?" Silence reigned in the office in answer to the question. Outside, the wind picked up and sand battered against the window pane in a rapid staccato pattern. The shadows of evening were held at bay by 3 different lamps, one of which burned brightly on the desk of the Kazekage. "Didn't you hear me?" "Yes, I heard you." Gara didn't even bother to lift his eyes from the document in front of him as he answered shortly. This seemed to annoy the one who was, in turn, trying to distract him from his work. "Hey, come on," he asked nicely, "and everything. Stop ignoring me." Gara dipped his brush into a nearby inkwell before returning it to the scroll to his right. It danced across the parchment, leaving graceful sweeps of calligraphy in its wake. Though he had no ear for beauty, he had always taken a quiet pride in his calligraphy. It was one of the few things that he was truly good at, and he genuinely enjoyed practicing the art. He found it calming. I'm so bored. Perhaps it would entertain you to leave, then. Kenkuro had once informed him that he was the master of unintended burns. He had also used the word sarcasm, although Gaara still wasn't sure he truly understood how sarcasm worked. The nuances of human interactions and societal niceties continued to linger just out of his reach of comprehension. Going by the offense on the face of his companion, he had just managed to do something like that again, although he wasn't sure how. What was insulting about suggesting that someone leave a boring situation to find an entertaining one? A pale hand made a swipe for the paperwork on his desk. Gaara didn't even try to stop it, knowing exactly what would happen. As he had expected, the spectral arm went right through his scrolls and reports, even through his own arm as well, leaving nothing disturbed even by an inch. He blinked up at the incorporeal form that hovered next to him. Shut up. But I did not say anything, he protested. Gaara huffed. I'm so bored. I hate being dead. Gaara frowned and returned to his work. It was lucky that only he could see the dead soul that followed him around. Some of the man's comments about Temeri's wardrobe would have had his sister in fits. Chapter 21, Kakashi is Sakura, the one where you stop aging. Kakashi honestly thought that when he reached 18 years old he would continue to age. It wasn't that he thought his soulmate was older than him. It was that he truly believed there could be no one out there for him. Surely he was too broken. Too bitter. Too stained. Surely the universe wouldn't be cruel enough to bind anyone to him for the rest of their lives. It was therefore a very large surprise when, at 3:26 p.m. on September 15th, the year he turned 18, Kakashi stopped aging. He was training alone, hiding out from Guy, when he felt it happen. It was the oddest sensation of his internal body clock suddenly pausing, as if his entire being were holding its breath. His stance wobbled, ruining his kata as it hit him. Then the only thing he could think of was what poor soul was waiting just to be disappointed by him. Every year that passed after that saddened him more and more. One by one most of his friends met their soulmates and began to age as they should. It seemed as if the only ones who didn't were Guy, who Kakashi thought might stay eternally young, and Tenza, who Kakashi had at one point thought would be his own soulmate. They would have at least been broken together, diving into the shadows of A and BU with hands held tight. He watched all of his friends grow steadily older, each year making him crawl further and further into his shell. He felt he couldn't relate to their happiness. 6 months before Kakashi's 32nd birthday found him no older than his 18th. He had gained a few scars but not a single age line. Some in the village had jokingly theorized that he was, in fact, Guy's soulmate, and the two of them would live forever due to the power of youth. On his good days he managed to laugh about it. On his bad days he tried not to cry. This particular day had Kakashi in the apartment of one of his students. Sakura had insisted that she wished to celebrate her birthday privately with only the people she was closest to here with her. Naruto and Ino were in the living room debating the merits of having a private party vs a public one. Kakashi stood in the kitchen helping his ex-student gather the food. He had been the first person she asked to come to her small little gathering because she knew he would understand her wishes. She didn't want to have everyone she knew watch her react when she stopped aging. Mostly she didn't want to see the disappointment of all the people hoping to be the soulmate of the next female Sannen. But I think you're going to have to do something about that secretary of yours, because when I tried to drop some files off to you yesterday she almost wouldn't let me in. She asked if I had an appointment. I never needed an appointment to see Shisho, and I certainly don't need one to see you. Kakashi smiled behind his mask at the indignation in her voice while making a mental note to have that talk with his secretary. He'd already told her that the members of Team 7 were priority number 1, that they were to be allowed in to see him even if he were in the middle of a meeting with the daimyo himself. He had been quietly looking for a new secretary for a few weeks already, though, so it was almost a wasted effort. And don't get me started on the council. How do you deal with them every day? She cast him a glance over her shoulder that was half exasperated and half admiring. Kakashi rolled his eyes. They walk a little softer around me, he admitted. I think some of them subscribe to the belief that I'm going to live forever, so they don't want to cross me too much. Not when they know I can hound them into their graves. She snorted out a laugh and handed him a large bowl. He set it on the table, glancing in as it passed under his nose and feeling his mouth watered at the sight of the rice mix inside. Kakashi could cook as well as the next guy, but someone else's cooking always tasted better. Hound them. That was a horrible pun, Hokage-sama. Her fond expression told him she had enjoyed it nonetheless. Even if he hadn't really meant to make a pun and wasn't sure whether she was referring to his old A&B code name or his infamy as a dog lover. He was just opening his mouth to reply when he was interrupted by Naruto bounding into the kitchen with both arms waving madly in the air. Ino followed close behind him, trying her best to look uninterested and only partially succeeding. She did manage to catch the swinging door before it could leave a large hole in the plaster of Sakura's kitchen wall. It's almost time, right? Right? You said it was soon. Naruto skidded on the linoleum floor, smashing his hip into the countertop, but the blow didn't even seem to register with him. It certainly didn't slow him down any. He kept going until he was right up in Sakura's face. Are you ready, Sakura-chan? Sakura pushed him off of her and grumbled, "Don't be so loud, idiot. I can hear you just fine." Ino picked her way around the pair of them and perched herself demurely on the countertop. He's right, though, the blonde said. It's almost time, forehead. You ready? Sakura nodded. I think so. I heard it feels weird to stop aging. They all pointedly avoided looking at Kakashi, making him roll his eyes exasperatedly. I wouldn't know, Ino chipped in instead. Tenten said it felt like pausing a movie and then losing the remote. All three of the younger kids laughed. Kakashi smiled to himself indulgently and fiddled with the food on the table, rearranging all the bowls and platters 1 inch to the left. He wasn't sure how to feel knowing that the kids he had helped raise now had the chance to grow older than him. It didn't seem fair, but at the same time he wanted all the best things in life for them. He hoped Sakura would find her soulmate quickly. Naruto bounced eagerly on the balls of his feet, bright blue eyes trailing on the clock. The kitchen was silent as they all watched the seconds hand tickets way round, collectively counting the last few seconds in their heads. As the clock struck 6:31 p.m., Naruto and Ino whipped their heads around to stare hard at Sakura, who was still staring at the clock. Well, they demanded in one shout. Sakura shrugged, confused. I didn't feel anything, she mumbled. For a heartbeat no one said anything. I did, Kakashi whispered. All eyes turned on him suddenly. His eyes were closed as the last tremors trickled down his spine. Restarting the aging process felt much like someone had removed a rubber band from around a limb and sensation was flooding back into it. Except the sensation was generalized around his entire body. When it was over, he opened his eyes but didn't look up from the floor. The feeling had struck him at exactly the same moment that Sakura had turned 18, and he was both excited and terrified to find out if that meant what he thought it did. He was excited because there was a chance that he finally had a special someone of his own, someone to love and cherish and spoil with gifts. He was terrified to see what she thought of the potential match. What if he had been right in his youth and Sakura was just the poor sod stuck with him, miserable and disappointed? He found that he couldn't make himself raise his head, too worried that it was true. Sakura made no noise when she moved, she was too well trained for that, but he saw her little feet appear in front of his and tensed. He watched her hands left and, for a moment, wondered if it would be better to let her hit him or to block. He didn't expect for her to gently place her fingers under his chin and lift it until his gaze met her own. Sensations racked him again as their eyes connected. He could feel the way his soul recognized hers, reaching out to connect them together. From listening to others, he knew that the tugging in his chest would never go away. It would be there for the rest of their lives, always pointing him in whatever direction she was in, leading the two halves of their whole back together again. Sakura seemed to be having trouble catching her breath from the experience. Kakashi, she whispered, making him swallow thickly. Had her voice always sounded like that? It was the sweetest music. Forehead. Is he? Ino was leaning so far forward she was in danger of falling off the counter. She and Naruto looked ready to burst if they didn't get some answers. Sakura leaned into Kakashi's chest, smiling when he circled her with his arms without a single thought. My soulmate, Sakura breathed just before their lips connected. The other two in the room were cheering and whooping, but Kakashi could barely hear them. All of his concentration was on the woman in his arms and the incredible lightness in his head. It appeared that he had been worried for nothing. If the tongue that had just brushed against his own was any indication, Sakura seemed fairly happy with the match. Chapter 22, Obito, Kasame, the one where you have a journal that connects you. Kasame wrote in his journal a lot. Posing as Toby, he was able to spend a lot of time around the other Akatsuki members without anyone taking much notice of him. One of the things that this pseudo-invisibility had shown him was that in every spare moment he had, Kasame wrote in his journal. Obito hadn't so much as opened his own journal in years, not since the day he met Ren. He remembered hearing her gush about how her soulmate had drawn her pictures even before they could write and vowing never to open his own again. He hadn't wanted anyone else's words, only hers. Now, a lifetime later, he was still dedicating everything he had to a girl who hadn't even loved him. Not that her lack of love in any way invalidated his own, of course. Just because he knew they could never be together didn't mean he couldn't love her from afar. Right? Scowling, Obito watched Kasame's pen scratching painstakingly at the page in front of him. He wasn't sure why it was suddenly bothering him now, after all these years, when it never had before. Why was he wondering what his own journal might contain? Why could he suddenly think of nothing but whether or not his soulmate had continued to reach out to him over the years? It took another 3 weeks and 4 more times catching Kasame with pen in hand before Obito capitulated, although it took several days for him to locate it. He had left it behind when he did the same to Konoha, and he was amazed to discover that his possessions still remained untouched in the abandoned Uchiha district. He'd been given his journal at birth, as everyone was, and it had started to show the years. The blank white cover was yellowed with age, one corner curling up and creased from being shoved into a space it didn't fit in. Obito stood in the bedroom he had slept in as a child and cradled the book gently in his hands, feeling nostalgia fill him up. He had been happy here, once. It had simply never occurred to him in all the years he had spent planning the world's destruction that, perhaps, he could have sought a different happiness within these pages. After all, wasn't this journal supposed to lead him to his soulmate? And wasn't his soulmate supposed to be the one person who would always love him? The one he was fated to love in return? He had spent so many years chasing Ren's ghost, closing his eyes and running forward blindly. The idea that it had all been for nothing was almost beyond comprehension. It took quite a bit of courage for Obito to slide one finger under the yellowed cover and flip it open to a random spot. His jaded heart thudded painfully in his chest when he saw messy writing scrolling across the page. Do you think I got it wrong? Probably. I get a lot of things wrong. I'm not that smart, but I'm strong, so I think it's their own fault for drawing a weapon but not pointing it in the right direction. Me being the weapon, if you didn't get that. The paragraph was all on its own, like a thought that someone had to write down before they forget, or a bit of conversation taken out of context. A few lines below was another disjointed paragraph. He was in a lot of pain and it was going to take him hours to die. They're angry at me for killing him, but wasn't that a mercy? Is it so hard to believe that someone like me understands the concept of mercy? Well, perhaps I didn't want to listen to him screaming and moaning. It was a mercy to me too. Obito breathed slowly, flipping through the pages. There was years' worth of writing inside. His soulmate obviously used the journal as a place to keep thoughts that they could say to no one else. He wondered what they thought of his failure to write anything back. That is, until he found an entry addressing that tucked somewhere close to the front. You never write back. Are you dead? I figure it's one of 3 reasons. Either you're dead, you lost your journal, or you can see me writing but you don't like me. That's fine. A lot of people don't like me. But you're my soulmate, I guess, and would have liked to meet you anyway. I don't think anyone will love me if you don't. That sounds pretty lonely. You're probably dead there. Which figures. Mai says all the time that I'm too much of a beast for anyone to love. She's probably right. His already broken heart crumbled just a little bit more. He couldn't help it. Somewhere out in the world there was someone who had been reaching out to him for years, and he had been ignoring them, eyes focused only on a girl who had never even looked in his direction. Obito frowned and flicked to the latest entries. There weren't very many pages left before the book would wipe itself clean, ready for new entries to connect the space between them. As he watched, fresh words appeared. His soulmate was writing to him at this very moment. Because leader is gone again. Now that Itachi is dead, I don't know who he thinks he's going to partner me with. I don't even know why he thinks we need partners in the first place. I'm fine on my own. Sure, always have been. More words were forming, but Obito didn't see them as he slammed the journal closed. He stared at the aged cover with his one eye wide. Could it be? The idea seemed impossible. He swallowed hard and braced himself, then slowly opened the journal once more to peek at the very first page. Hello. My name is Kasame. There was a lot of space between that first entry and the next, a pattern that followed for the first few pages. Kasame had left him space to reply, had called out to him to do so, tried to wheedle a response from him in the early entries. It was easy to see when he stopped trying. The entries became less conversational, less questions, and more about simply a sharing of thoughts without expecting anything in return. Obito's hands shook, but he didn't drop the journal. He cast about the dust-covered room for something to write with. A few pens stood upright in a cup on his old desk, but he figured they would have dried out by now. Finally he spotted a pencil and grabbed it up. Then stopped. What in the name of the Sage of Six Paths was he supposed to say? Sorry that I've ignored you your whole life. Taking a deep breath, Obito returned to the latest pages and put the pencil to the paper, watching Kasame's spiky writing continue to jump and skitter. It wasn't graceful writing, but then neither was his own. Hello, Kasame. The two words wrote themselves with little thought from him. Kasame's writing, only an inch above his own, suddenly stopped in mid-sentence. He waited with bated breath, half afraid of what the response would be. Well, look who decided to show up. Obito chuckled a little in relief, sitting down on the rickety chair beside him and setting his journal on the desk. It didn't occur to him that it was the first real laugh he had let out in years. He was too preoccupied. My apologies. I have only just now recovered my journal. He didn't notice the smile on his face as he watched spiky letters spread out at a hurried pace. Kasame had so many questions and obviously couldn't decide which to ask first. He could picture the blue-skinned hulk of a man hunched over in a chair, pen flickering as he tried to write faster and dark hair falling across his forehead. As he wrote back and forth, partaking in the first honest conversation he'd ever had with his soulmate, the pain that had gathered in his chest over the past decade and more slowly drained away. His tense shoulders relaxed and his lungs felt as if they could draw breath properly. Uchiha Obito sat in the house he was raised in the village he had loved, and in the course of one afternoon he learned to live again while thoughts of the infinite Tsukiyomi faded away. Perhaps this world had something in it to live for after all. Chapter 23, Tobirama Obito, the one where you have the AG meat on your wrist. Tobirama spent a lot of time staring moodily at his wrist when no one was watching. There was an ongoing debate within his clan over whether his brand had caused his personality or his personality was to blame for his brand. No one could ever say for sure. All he knew was that he had been born with the age he would meet his soulmate burned into his skin, just like the rest of the population, but his was different than anyone else's. His brand told him he would somehow not meet his soulmate until he was 110 years old. 110 years old. The first thing that always angered him about this was the fact that he was going to be alone for over 100 years. The second thing was that, after living that long, it was likely that he would keel over the moment they met. The third thing that made him angry, the thing he never mentioned to anyone and hoped they never thought of it themselves because it was embarrassing, if he wasn't going to meet his soulmate until he was over 100, did that mean he would never lose his virginity? Was it even possible to still have sex at that age? Would they be the same age as him? Would they be way younger than him and not want that sort of relationship? Tobirama snorted and shuffled further down on the couch he was lounging on. He was supposed to be writing out the results of his latest jutsu experiment. Instead he was moping about his wrist again, only free to do so because Hashirama and Mido were training right now. He dared not mope with Mido living with them now. Her ideas of ways to cheer him up were scary at best. Horrifying at worst. He might be a 23-year-old adult and the second strongest shinobi in the Senju clan, but that didn't stop him from stepping lightly around his brother's wife. With a slow and happy sigh, Tobirama decided he might as well return to his work. Staring gloomily wasn't going to make his number change, so he should probably actually get something done. That way it would be less obvious what he had really spent his time alone doing. As he reached for his pen, however, what he saw from the corner of his eye made him freeze and stare in equal parts wonder and horror. His number was moving. Where previously he had been branded with the number 110 in thick bold font, the digits were now slowly ticking backwards like a timer counting down. Tobirama didn't so much as draw a breath, holding himself perfectly still as he watched the number shrink smaller and smaller. His lungs were burning by the time it finally stopped, ending on 24. The first breath he drew felt more like gasping, floundering, like trying to breathe for the very first time. He distantly registered the sounds of his family returning home but was unable to react. Hashirama called out his name a few times until the two of them came into the room and saw him staring at his arm with an unreadable expression. Tobirama, his brother, took a few cautious steps towards him. "What's wrong?" He and his wife both jumped when Tobirama's head shot up and they saw the wild look in his eyes. "My brand," was all he managed to say, shoving his arm out at them with no further explanation. Mido grabbed his wrist to hold it still so they could see what he was talking about. When she saw it, her jaw dropped open. Hashirama made a noise typically only heard from the mouths of children under 5 years old. "It changed. Your brand changed. Oh my God." With arms flailing in every direction, Hashirama spun about the room spouting exclamations of shock. Mida, at the very least, kept her head. Her thumb passed over the spot where there had once been a third digit. There was now nothing but skin. Not a trace of ink or even a bit of redness remained. "How did this happen?" she asked him. Tobirama stared up at her helplessly. "I don't know," he admitted. Across the room, Hashirama went quiet. When even Tobirama had nary a guess, it wasn't usually a good thing. Although time passed and the three of them tossed around several theories, no answers were to be had that day. In fact, it took almost a full year for him to discover the reason for the change in his brand. In that time, Hashirama had finally made peace with Madara and construction of the village of their dreams was underway. The day that changed Tobirama's life was the day the two clans finally immigrated to the spot where they would hopefully spend the rest of their lives in peace. All the clan members still living in the war camps that had sustained them for generations made the journey to what had recently been christened Konoha, and he was one of the ones tasked with organizing the influx of citizens. Since he had helped design the layout of each district, it was easy enough to direct newcomers to the proper areas for each clan and their many branches. He was standing outside of the Uchiha district helping Madara give directions to a suspiciously glaring old woman when a loud voice called out over the noise of the crowded street. "Bakasha." Tobirama's had wicked around to spot the source of the disturbance. Peripherally, he noted that all the members of the Uchiha clan were ignoring the noise, and some of them had developed indulgent expressions on their faces. What he saw was two men who appeared to be around his own age range chasing each other across the roofs of several half-finished houses. One of them had silver hair and a cloth mask covering most of his features. He appeared to be fleeing from a man with black hair and painful-looking scars on the right side of his face. The silver-haired one executed a graceful front flip over the wall of the last building in its row, landing in the street and immediately diving behind Madara for cover. The black-haired man skidded to a stop in front of Madara, who crossed his arms and stared him down with a raised eyebrow. "That's not fair, you can't always hide behind him," the scarred man raged. "Get back over here and let me kick your ass." The silver-haired man popped his head over the Uchiha clan head's shoulder only to thumb his nose at the one who had chased him. Tobirama blinked, utterly bewildered. Who? He couldn't even begin to form the question. Madara rolled his eyes and jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "This would be my soulmate, Hate Kakashi," he announced in a flat voice. Kakashi's eye turned upwards in what he surmised must be a smile and saluted him with 2 fingers. "That one there is Uchiha Obito. The two of them are unique in their circumstances." Kakashi huffed a laugh. "That's one way to put it, Tara-chan." Tobirama wasn't sure whether he was more bewildered by the fact that Madara actually allowed that diminutive form of his name to slip past without comment, or the fact that tiny spots of pink appeared on his cheeks when it was said. Deciding that he really didn't want any details about the uptight man's sex life, Tobirama turned to this new Uchiha, who stood with his fists clenched and eye narrowed, glaring at his escaped quarry. "Obito, was it? Welcome to Konoha." He tried for politeness. Obito scoffed. Welcome yourself, I got here first. The young man looked over at him and Tobirama noticed for the first time how his left eye was covered with a dark eye patch, blending in with his inky hair. I beg your pardon. He was further poleaxed when the man's entire demeanor suddenly flipped from anger to awe. His one visible eye widened in an almost blank look of surprise bloomed when there had only moments ago been a frown. His clenched hands fell loose as his whole being froze with what appeared to be stunned disbelief. You're, oh my god, you and you Tobirama, you're my, he couldn't seem to finish his sentence. Tobirama could feel his head slowly tilting to the side, dragged down by the weight of his confusion. The man named Kakashi was sniggering behind his hand and Madara looked like he was only moments away from sprouting flames out of his ears. Don't fawn over him. He's a senju. Have some Uchiha pride, you useless dash. The clan had cut himself off, almost inarticulate with rage. Obito spared him a haughty look. Oh, stuff it, Gramps. Madara's eye twitched. Kakashi was almost seizing from holding in his laughter, and Tobirama had never been so bewildered in all of his days. He'd never heard anyone speak so disrespectfully to this titan of the warrior. He hadn't thought anyone would survive doing so. Finally he managed to say, you know me, I presume. Don't expect him to remember you when he hasn't met you yet, Kakashi managed to puff out between bursts of laughter. You're such an idiot. He doesn't even know where we are from. As if there was something inherently amusing about their origins, this set him off again. He had to clutch onto Madara to stop himself from falling over. His laughter seemed to irritate Obito, who glared briefly before turning back to Tobirama and holding a hand out eagerly. The scars on his face pulled back when he smiled. Tobirama found himself thinking that it would be interesting to trace them. He wondered what their texture would be under his fingertips. Just forget that then. It's nice to meet you. I'm Uchiha Obito, as the old windbag said. He ignored Madara's protesting nises. Tobirama hesitated. Well, as I said, welcome to Konoha, he murmured, then reached out to take the offered hand. He was wholly unprepared for the moment their skin touched. It felt like something clicked inside of him, sliding into place to fill a gaping hole he had previously been unaware of. The brand on his wrist grew warm, glowing through the cuffs of his shirt in a way he had seen a few times before. The last time he had seen it was the day Hashirama had met Mida. Obito and Tobirama stared at each other in silence, still connected by their clasped hands as the light from their wrists faded away. The senju felt strangely aware of the one he was touching. He felt like, if he concentrated hard enough, he could learn all of the secrets hidden away behind those scars. He felt like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. Now that it had come, he found he had no idea what to do. Eventually the two of them realized that they were still standing in the street holding hands and staring at each other without saying a word. They both quickly dropped their arms and looked away, Tobirama glaring at the citizens around them to make them turn away. After the sight, Kakashi and Madara were both sporting rather smug looks, something that appeared to rub Obito the wrong way. Either of you got something to say, he growled, one fist coming up so he could shake it at them threateningly. Kakashi shrugged as he slung a casual arm around Madara's waist. I'm happy for you, Obito, Kakashi said. I am, however, going to enjoy watching you explain to him where we come from. By the cringe that this comment elicited and the wary glance his way, Tobirama surmised that there must be quite an interesting story there. He was right. Very much later that evening he sat stunned with things like time travel and born in the future running through his mind. The description of the infinite Tsukiyomi he had been given was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Knowing that the Edo Tensei he himself had invented had been used in such a disgusting manner put his emotions through trials he had never experienced before. He finally understood why his brand had changed, however. Obito and Kakashi had been born long after Tobirama himself was supposed to die. The how of their trip into the past was still being looked into, even a year after they had arrived. After most of the heavy truths had been admitted, Madara and Kakashi left to allow them some time to talk privately. Tobirama sat on a bench in his newly grown garden, eyes on the stars above him, mind on the warmth of the man at his side. Obito was a jaded and broken man who was slowly finding his way back to the person he had once been. When Tobirama lifted a hand and traced the scars on his partner's face, he discovered them to be softer than he'd imagined. They molded under his touch, shifting where he pressed them. He wondered if the man underneath them might be the same, if he could be reshaped into someone who was not ruled by pain and anger. Looking into the bright eye that watched him but said nothing, he decided he was willing to find out. He had spent enough time brooding about wanting this. If he had to fight to keep it, he would. Chapter 24, Tobirama Azuna, the one we feel each other's pain. The second his blade slides into Azuna's chest, he realizes his error. How he never realized it before is beyond him, with all the times they have battled. There is no mistaking it now. As his sword cuts through armor and flesh and organs, pain unlike anything he has ever felt blossoms in his own torso. He gasps for breath while the other man meets his eyes, both horrified as the realization hits them at the same time. They go down together. Madara's enraged shout barely registers over the sound of ringing in his ears. Tobirama struggles to reach across the small distance between them, his hand scrubbling in the dirt and trailing through the blood oozing from Azuna's wounds. Wounds that he himself inflicted. Get away from him. Madara growls, pulling his brother into his arms. Tobirama makes a noise of protest as the pain that racks through Azuna's body at the movement crashes down over him as well. His eyes roll wildly, searching. "Brother," he calls out weakly. Hashirama appears at his side in an instant, worried. The whole battlefield saw the blow that brought down his opponent. No one saw any reason for him to fall as well. He clutches at his brother's pauldrons and chokes out, "Heal hen." From the corner of his eye he sees Madara pause, stunned at his request. Azuna's blood trickles out from a bloody smile. Hashirama stops searching for injuries to blink at him in bemusement. "Heal who? Are you all right? Heal him. Please." Tobirama closes his eyes against the pain. It isn't his pain, but it is pain that he inflicted, and that makes it harder to bear. He's hurting, he manages to whisper, then clenches his teeth. His stomach is rebelling against the sensations and his vision is blurring. He and Azuna bear up under the pain in silence, but it's a close call for both of them. This feels like dying. If he allows Azuna to leave, it will end in death, he knows. It's a good thing his brother is a healer. Without pausing to ask silly questions like why, Hashirama darts over to where the Uchiha brothers are holding each other only a few feet away. Hashirama has always been a good brother this way, always willing to do as he requests without fully understand the reason he asks. Madara eyes him with suspicion, but even this god of destruction can recognize the grain tinge of healing chakra being offered to him. He allows Hashirama to press hands into the weeping wound in Azuna's chest. Relief so thick it borders on ecstasy spreads through them both. Tobirama gasps and presses a hand to where he almost expects there to be a hole in his own armor. There isn't, but he holds his hand there anyway. His eyes close and he gasps through the feeling of the wound that isn't his slowly closing. By the sage, they are soulmates. He's not sure who it is that says it first, but suddenly almost everyone in both of their clients is exclaiming how they never saw this coming. When he feels less like throwing up, Tobirama lolls his head to the side and opens his eyes. Azuna is looking back at him. He looks grateful, an expression Tobirama isn't used to seeing in the eyes of anyone not a child. When the pain is manageable, he sits up, fingers scraping against the rocks and the grit. Azuna's palms clench. When Hashirama allows the healing chakra to fade away, he can tell that the job isn't done. Long years watching his brother learn to heal others, however, gives him the experience to know that this is a hurt that will take more than one session to heal. A dirty battlefield is not the place to continue treatment. The head of the Senju clan sits back on his heels and, with a hopeful expression, holds out his hand to the head of Uchiha clan. Madara tilts his head, arms tightening around the brother he could have lost if not for the universe having the good sense to connect two people's souls. Azuna murmurs encouragingly, eyes still on the one whose blade had pierced him. Shinobi of both clans begin to cheer when the two shake hands, sealing peace between them at long last. Tobirama cheers in his heart, his gaze locked with the man whose pain still throbs in his chest. Azuna smiles again. Tobirama smiles with him. Chapter 25, Yamato of Sai, the one where you can speak after you meet. A lot of books and television shows like to romanticize the moment when two soulmates meet. It was true that the moment was supposed to be a wonderful thing and that it was only upon meeting one soulmate that it became possible for a person to speak. What Yamato found ridiculous was the way the moment was presented in the romance genre. He was really sick of movies that presented it as if gaining the ability to do something automatically meant that you carried the knowledge of how to do it. He may have just been bitter about his speech therapy not going well today. Yamato was scowling when he entered the dark apartment. It melted from his face, however, when he caught sight of the young man seated on his couch. Sai had his legs folded underneath him with his sketchbook in his lap. Today's medium appeared to be chalk, judging by the range of colored pieces spread out on the coffee table. The pale artist was making tiny marks on the page with a piece of gray chalk, his hand as sure and steady as it always was. A smile grew to replace the scowl as he walked over and started moving art supplies to make room for himself to sit down as well. Sai would have come to speech therapy with him if he had any interest in learning to speak. Sign language was a universally understood language, and it was silent, so it worked better for people in their line of work. Besides, he had told Yamato he only had one word he would ever need to learn, and it had been easy enough to master. One peek over a pale shoulder, and Yamato's smile grew so wide that it almost took over his whole face. Both of them were depicted sitting in a tree with the hanging boughs shielding them from the rest of the world, enjoying a private moment together. To show his gratitude, Yamato leaned over and pressed a chaste kiss to Sai's cheek. Sai looked up at him for the first time since he had arrived home, affection only just shining through in the too well-trained stillness of his face. Yamato, Sai murmured in his stilted voice. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. Chapter 26, Kakashi Aruka, the one where a tattoo on you shows up on your soulmate. When it first appeared, Aruka's initial thought was, I'm too young to die. It might have been a silly thought, but it was excusable because he was only 11 years old and he had woken up to find an echo of the mark of the ANBU riding on his shoulder. The idea of his soulmate being in ANBU was terrifying enough. Even more terrifying was the idea that they must be quite a bit older than him. ANBU was the place of the most elite and darkened shinobi. There were the beasts that fed the nightmares of small children, the shadows that struck fear into the hearts of the most hardened warriors. It was not a place for young ones. And his soulmate had just joined up. It was only a few months later that Aruka lost his parents in the Ninetales attack. He had pressed his hand to the echo on his shoulder, desperate for someone strong to come help him. Whoever it was that had originally gotten the tattoo should have felt it going warm inside their skin. They should have answered his call. The only one that came was a slim ANBU with silver hair who tossed him over their shoulders and wordlessly bore him away despite his protests. Aruka's young mind didn't want to be rational. He didn't want to admit that even though they would feel the warmth, they would have no idea where the call was coming from. The experience of losing one's parents was not an experience that usually helped someone think rationally. Aruka was very bitter for a long time afterwards. It took 2 years and a lot of long talks with the Sandaime before Aruka straightened up his act and realized that it wasn't his soulmate's fault that his parents had died. It was the Ninetales that had killed them, not the inaction of someone who couldn't have known where he was. It wasn't even the fault of the person who took him away. Bringing a child to safety was a priority over assisting 2 fully capable shinobi. Aruka vowed to work hard and find his place in the village, to serve his parents' memories by doing his best for Konoha. Upon letting go of his anger, Aruka then developed a new obsession. He wanted to find his soulmate. There were a limited number of options. The village could only have so many ANBU, after all. The problem was catching them and seeing if they reacted when he touched his echo. He could have gotten a tattoo of his own and shown it off to try and bring them to him through word of mouth. He was still a little young though, and he had no idea what kind of tattoo he would want to permanently etch into his skin. Besides, how hard could it be to catch an ANBU? The answer to that was very. Aruka was, in the words of his teacher, a tricky little shit. He was good at traps and running and hiding. He was good at defensive stuff. What he was not was a trekker. Or an infiltrator. He was nowhere near sneaky enough to get close to a member of the Black Ops. Not to say that it stopped him from trying. The most common place to find an ANBU was when they were guarding the Hokage. It wasn't as if they were easy to spot, but at least you always knew they were there somewhere. Aruka spent a lot of time drinking tea and playing shogi with Lord Hiruzen while his eyes roamed the shadows, equal parts suspicious and hopeful. The first ANBU he tried to catch reverse-tracked him, surprised him from behind, and knocked him out with a single blow. He woke up to a lecture and a bad headache. The second ANBU he found led him in circles for a full 3 hours before he realized that they knew he was following them and were playing a game to mess with his head. He scowled and shouted, stomping his foot, and the woman had the audacity to laugh at him before disappearing in a puff of smoke. Turned out he'd been following a clone the whole time. The third ANBU Aruka tried to catch had picked him up by the scruff of the neck and dangled him off the side of the Hokage monument, hundreds of feet in the air. The interrogation he had gone through that day was embarrassing. He had both been forced to spill his reason for following them and been laughed at. A prick in the arm that he never even felt rendered him unconscious while the ANBU was still laughing. He woke up to another lecture, although this time without a headache. He became the butt of their jokes for a bit after that. Aruka spotted ANBU absolutely everywhere as they tried to entice the child into chasing them. He was smart enough to realize that they were making fun of him though, and for a while he gave up on trying. He came to recognize some of the masks and mimics which ones he had encountered. Only a few never tried to engage in. It was around that time that the rumors started to reach his ears, two pieces of information that drove him to distraction. He started to hear that there was another child in ANBU. He hadn't even known there had been one before. That news floored him as he realized there was a potential for his soulmate to be close to his own age. He also started to hear about the friend killer, the broken ANBU who was too young to already be so lost to the darkness. Putting clues together, Aruka surmised that the friend killer was one of ones who had never tried to get him to chase them. He was one of the silent figures who embodied their mask, slipping through the darkness and wearing it like a well-fitted cloak, the ones who guarded the Hokage without letting a child see them. Aruka, however, had not entirely let the habit of being a tricky little shit fall to the wayside. Despite the terrible moniker his comrades had bestowed on him, the friend killer had all the makings of being the one Aruka was looking for. He wanted to meet them. And he knew just how to do it. Step number 1 was to respond to the teasing that still happened from time to time. The first time he acted surprised and gave chase to the ANBU who let him see them, they were so surprised in return he almost actually caught them. After a quickly muffled chortle and the employment of a rather hasty body flicker, the ANBU led him on a merry chase for an hour before he lost them somewhere around Training Ground 3. Suddenly ANBU showed up everywhere he went again. He spent a couple of weeks chasing them before finally one of them caught him instead, hoping to tease him a bit before knocking him out as had been done before. Instead, Aruka surprised his captor with a play for help. The man bearing a badger mask was so thrown off by his idea they almost dropped him. Then they laughed for a few minutes while he dangled in the air, bristling with indignation. Even if he isn't who you're looking for, that little shit deserves to think you are. Maybe it'll knock some humanity into him. The voice behind the badger mask seemed to rumble up from the deepest part of his torso, and Aruka grinned at making someone so gruff laugh so hard. Now that he knew it wasn't at him. "So you'll help?" he asked brightly. The ANBU put him down on the roof they were on top of, patting his shoulder with a hand the size of a dinner plate. His knees almost buckled. "I can guarantee you, kid, we'll all help." The next thing Aruka knew, he had ANBU swooping into his bedroom window late at night to discuss the best way to trap one of their own and present him as a gift to a young genin. In between training with his team and running D-rank mission, Aruka became the quietest little celebrity that their village had ever seen. They all had advice and helpful hints. One of them informed him that the one he was after had no idea about it, as he didn't engage with his comrades and hadn't heard any of the recent gossip. He was given so many suggestions for ways to trap his quarry that he spent weeks trying to decide which one to go with. In the end, the decision was taken out of his hand when a fox-masked ANBU dropped into his room, scooped him up, and fled off into the night with him on her back. Aruka knew it might be stupid to trust them all so blindly, but he still let out a whoop as they flew above the village, when throwing his loose hair every which way. Their brief flight ended in the middle of the arena typically used for the Chunin exams. Aruka could see a perimeter of shadows even deeper than the actual darkness that nighttime cast over the seating areas. He'd never seen so many ANBU in one place. Only moments later, 3 figures touched down 10 feet in front of him, the 2 on the sides restraining the one in the middle. Aruka blinked in surprise at seeing the slim ANBU with silver hair, the one who had rescued him from the battlefield on the night his parents died. He was squirmed and grumbling, uttering threats in an attempt to get away from the 2 holding him in place. I hear you've got a birthday coming up soon, the woman with the fox mask said to him. We all chipped in and got you something. Iruka giggled. Let go of me, you idiots. The silver-haired ANBU was demanding. He stumbled a bit when his two captors shoved him forward but didn't try to run. By the way his mask turned side to side, he could also see the ring of hidden assassins that had him hemmed in. Iruka took a couple of steps toward him. Hi there. My name's Iruka. He waved, feeling a bit silly. What do you want, kid? The older boy asked. His arms folded in front across his chest played impatiently. One of his comrades smacked his shoulder for his tone but said nothing. Iruka took a steadying breath before squaring his shoulders and marching forward a little farther. He stopped when he was face to face with the one the villagers called Friend Killer and looked up into the eyes of a mask painted like a hound. This mask was inherently no scarier than all the others. It was who stood behind it that people feared. Iruka found himself mostly just curious. I wanted to check something, he said in a clear voice. Maybe someone smarter than him would have something momentous to say, but Iruka didn't often waste his time trying to be momentous or impressive. So without further ado he lifted the sleeve of his t-shirt, tried not to react to the interested head tilt from the silver-haired ANBU, and pressed his hand onto the echo he had just revealed. As it always did, the translucent red mark felt warm under his fingers. Every person inside the silent stadium, hidden and not, watched with bated breath as the other boy's hand whipped up to grab at his own shoulder, fingers pressing into the tattoo that marked him as a member of the Black Ops. It is him, the woman with the fox mask cried triumphantly. You are his soulmate. Yes, the hound said, rubbing at his tattoo. Iruka couldn't make his fingers unclench even though he knew he was making the mark burn. The one who had punched the hound threw their hands up in the air. You knew. Of course I knew, the boy huffed. He called me the night of the QB attack. He paused and looked over at Iruka, his mask tilting to the side in question. You really didn't realize that I was responding to you? Iruka mouthed soundlessly at first before blurting, no. I thought it was just some random you knew this whole time. How could you never came and talk to me? He watched the mask turn side to side as the one who was evidently his asshole of a soulmate looked around at the people listening in on their conversation. This isn't the place to talk about this, the other boy said, stepping forward to take Iruka's elbow in a light grip. There was a jerking sensation in his gut and a blur of color before his eyes, then suddenly they were somewhere else. Iruka had never loaned the body flicker, and he hadn't known you could drag someone along for the ride like that. His stomach churning, he decided to take that jutsu off of his list of ones he wanted to learn. It was not comfortable. When he was able to concentrate on his surroundings, he noted that they were in an unfamiliar apartment. They had arrived in the kitchen, but he could see a futon rolled up in the corner as if someone slept in here instead of the bedroom that was surely only just down the hall. The room was meticulously clean, he could see that even in the dark, but it was almost barren. There were no decorations and no personal items. Movement drew his eye and he looked over to see the one who brought him here stepping back and lifting a hand to his mask. Iruka watched, wide-eyed, as it was removed to reveal the identity of his soulmate for the first time. Then his breath caught in his throat. He knew this boy. They'd never met personally, but the whole village knew who Hate Kakashi was. And he suddenly felt incredibly dumb for not realizing who this was, because who else was around his age with silver hair and good enough to be inducted into the most elite fighting force there was. Look, I'm sorry, I thought you knew who I was and what I was. What I am. Kakashi rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. Iruka frowned. Well, I didn't, he said. I've been looking everywhere for you. I didn't know that, Kakashi mumbled, looking at his feet. I thought you knew it was me during the QB attack. Then you never said anything, so I figured you didn't want me. I didn't blame you, to be honest. I wouldn't want me either. He seemed to be unable to look anywhere close to Iruka's face, so he likely missed the flabbergasted expression that he was wearing. Iruka's shoulders drooped as he mumbled, oh. Kakashi just nodded his head a little awkwardly. There was silence in the room as they both shuffled their feet. Iruka felt a little bit stupid and a little bit guilty. His soulmate had known who he was this whole time but thought he hadn't wanted him. The rumors about the friend killer suddenly made a lot more sense. They said he was reckless with his own life and seemed cut off from those around him. Naruto supposed he'd act that way too if he thought his soulmate didn't want him. "I'm sorry," he managed to say eventually. "I don't, not want you. I mean that I do want you. I know that people call you friend killer, but I don't think you'd really do that, and it would be great to, spend time with you. And get to know you. Would that be all right? Because, well, Yura was a little scared when I got my echo, but I've really wanted to meet you and know." The rest of whatever he was going to ramble on about was choked back when he suddenly found arms around him. His face was pressed into a solid chest as Kakashi hugged him almost too tightly. Naruto was so stunned at first that he didn't react, then slowly he raised his arms and hugged the older boy back. "I'd like that," Kakashi mumbled above his head. Naruto smiled. He knew Kakashi was older than him and they might not have much in common, but he also knew that it wouldn't matter. He would love every flaw and imperfection that Kakashi had to offer just as much as he would love his good qualities. When the arms holding him shifted so a hand could press against his echo, he smiled in contentment. This was where he belonged. This was the person he belonged to. Naruto was 16 the first time they kissed. He backed Kakashi into a corner and tried hard to ignore the laughter against his lips. He was 19 the first time they made love. He was honestly surprised Kakashi had held out that long. He was even more surprised when it was sweet and slow and everything a first time should be. He got a tattoo the next morning and watched an echo of the kanji for both their names print itself across Kakashi's skin. He was 22 when they got married in a quiet ceremony in the garden of the old Hatekon, the same place that Kakashi's parents got married. They both wore the colors of each other's clans and he couldn't remember ever being happier than that day. Naruto was 27 the first time Kakashi died, although he didn't find out until hours after. He was 83 when Kakashi died the second time. He closed his eyes and laid his head down, and Naruto had been 83 when they found him beside his husband. Chapter 27, Tenten a Hiden, the one where you can feel each other's pain. When she was young, Tenten was happy. She remembered her parents mostly in flashes of sensation. Her mother was the smell of baking bread and her father was the weight of a hand ruffling her hair. The accident that took them happened so long ago that she could only remember pieces of it. She remembered the terror and confusion, the way her civilian father's hand had shook while he tried to wield a kunai. The starkest memory was the sudden pain that flared in her chest, driving her to her knees. It's the last memory that still haunts her. The doctors had told her it wasn't a medical condition the way she thought of it. It was most likely a form of PTSD flashbacks. The older she got, the more often she felt the pains. They had a tendency to strike at the strangest times. Sometimes in the shower, sometimes in class. Often she woke up to the pain in the middle of the night. Tenten wondered if her soulmate felt the pain or if it was really just all in her head the way the Medinin thought it was. As she went through the academy, all of her teachers told Tenten that she would never make it as a ninja if she had a condition that could drive her to her knees at any given moment. She scowled at them and said, "Watch me." It took years of hard work and harder training, but Tenten managed to achieve her dream. She became a kunoichi with her own personal style. But more important than that, she learned to conquer her pain. The flashes of agony never stopped coming and she never had any warning when they would hit, but she had trained to be able to withstand them, to ride through them without any outward sign of the pain she felt inside. When she was 17 years old, Tenten was happy. Life had been good to her for the most part. She had a great team and a wonderful group of friends. Evil things might be on the horizon for the village and the world, but she still found the time to stop and enjoy the little things. Life changed when one of her comrades died, the sensei of some of her friends. Tenten wasn't part of the mission to track down the culprits, but she was there to comfort them when all was said and done. The loss of their sensei was a harsh blow. As she listened to their story and what they had gone through, however, she realized that it might not only be their sensei that had been lost. They described to her the method by which Asuma had died and the man that had killed him, the ritual that ended with a spear through the heart. The idea occurred to her then but was frantically dismissed. It seemed impossible almost. But then days and weeks began to roll by without a single attack of pain. In fact, she felt nothing at all where she should normally be able to feel all the daily aches and pains that her soulmate experiences, stubbed toes, a close call with a kunai, a new bruise, anything. The absence of pain held against the description of that evil man's attack began to fill her mind. It took 3 months before she admitted to herself what seemed so far-fetched. The man who had killed Asuma had been her soulmate. The pains she had felt all her life were not a form of PTSD, they were the sensation of her soulmate stabbing himself through the heart in a twisted ritual of death. It hurt in a way she had never known. It hurt like possibilities being taken from her, like heights she would never reach, like a goal she would never see completed. 1010's soulmate was dead at the hands of her good friends before she ever got the chance to meet him. More than that, he had been the one that had killed her parents. He had been the one to take what was most precious to her. They were doomed from the start, she realized when this at long last occurred to her. She could never have loved him. She never told anyone, not wanting to change the way her friends saw her. But in private she mourned the things that should have been hers. There were times when the unfairness of it all choked her lungs like a squeezing band of almost unbearable pain. Yet, 1010 had spent years training for just this kind of thing. She was a strong kunoichi and a strong person. She had fought through pain before, and she would continue to fight through this pain too. She had to. Chapter 28, Shikamaru Tayuya, the one where you heal each other. Shikamaru was still riding the high of breaking the genjutsu, still feeling pretty smart for tricking such a worthy opponent. And there was no doubt she was worthy. He'd already marked her as someone who must be very good at shogi. But as he caught her in the grip of his shadow strangle jutsu and planted a fist in her gut, something changed. Or more accurately, he could feel something changing. He was bruised and battered, his limbs aching with fatigue from the trials of their mission. But as he remained pressed against her, even if only through the cotton of her shirt, he could feel that tiredness falling away. He could feel the soreness of his bruises fading, and he knew the few scrapes he'd picked up would be healing over on their own. Tayuya's eye locked onto the marks he knows were on his face, watching them disappear with growing horror. That same horror raged through Shikamaru at the same time. How could it be her? How could an enemy turn out to be the soulmate he was bound to? It was like he was in some cliché teenage romance novel, and this was the big plot twist. Don't think this makes a difference? Tayuya growled at him. He sighed. This was all just so troublesome. Moments later Tayuya was swept away from in front of him by what appeared to be a winjutsu that came out of nowhere. Shikamaru turned to see, of all people, Temari of the Sand Village. Apparently she had been called in to help back him up. Things escalated after that, even though Shikamaru took a backseat through most of the action. He'd done plenty already, and if Temari wanted to show off, he wasn't going to exert himself. It didn't take too long before his new ally had his opponent unconscious and buried under the mess that was left over after cutting off the tops of every tree in a mile radius. While Temari stopped to take a breather and glowed a bit, Shikamaru found his eyes trained on Tayuya. Her curse mark had retreated, taking away the horns and returning her skin to its usual pallor. In repose he supposed she could be called beautiful. Not that he would know about such things. He was much more interested in wondering whether or not he was going to be expected to carry the unconscious woman back to the village. Turns out he did have to. Temari gave some crap about it not being a woman's job. Shikamaru kept his opinions about the stupidity of that to himself. Upon reaching the village and handing over his defeated opponent, Shikamaru's attention was immediately diverted to waiting for news about his injured comrades. He didn't think about Tayuya for a couple of days, not until he was called upon by the Hokage for questioning. When he entered the room and found her sitting there, conscious but bound and eyeing him warily, he hadn't expected to feel his heart thump inside his chest. He sighed. This was all going to be much too much trouble for a guy who just wanted to watch the clouds. Chapter 29, Deidara Watacha, the one where lies appear on your skin. A small bell somewhere out of sight chimed delicately when he pushed the door open. Deidara had never been here before, but he had more than one friend who swore that he would love it. Seeing as his last hairdresser had banned him from ever entering the premises again, he figured now was as good a time as any to try the infamous Uchiha salon. He hoped that this new place wasn't picky about people setting off firecrackers. His first impression was that it was very clean. Everything was in its place and the floor was meticulously clear of any debris except for where a young woman was receiving a trim. The decor was pleasant without being brash, although he preferred louder colors himself. It didn't look too bad in here. The working hairdressers even appeared competent. He made his way over to the reception desk, where someone with long hair pulled into a low ponytail was bent over a scheduling book and rapped his knuckles on the counter. When the employee lifted their head, he was forced to make a poor recovery from pulling a shocked face. This man was gorgeous. His black hair nearly matched his eyes, which were framed with long sooty lashes and set above pronounced hair troughs. His nose was delicate and his mouth almost dainty. It was a face that looked only moments away from raising a thin eyebrow at you. Deidara nearly choked on his tongue trying to speak. "I just need a wash and a trim, UN." He scowled when his voice came out sounding defensive. "Looking for a new hairdresser." The last place was full of idiots. He had to bite down on the inside of his cheek when the gorgeous employee behind the desk really did raise an eyebrow. The black-haired man looked up at Deidara's blonde nest and simply studied him in silence for a minute. He scowled again, feeling self-conscious. Just as he was about to open his mouth and say something offensive, he was cut off. "You would be Deidara, I presume. Kasame told me that he had convinced you to come here." That voice. It was low and smooth. The really attractive part, however, was the quiet confidence hiding there. Deidara fought back a swoon and grunted inelegantly. He wasn't much help in the convincing, but whatever, he said. "Can we get this going or not?" His question was met with a single nod before the man stood up from behind the desk and led him towards one of the chairs at the wash station. Deidara took a seat where indicated, flopping down facing away from a pristine ceramic sink and leaning his neck on the edge. The employee washed his hair in silence, long fingers massaging various products into his scalp in such a manner that he was hard-pressed to hold in a few minds. The last hairdresser he had used had been brusque and rough during this step, and he'd always worried about having his precious hair pulled out. After he was properly washed and conditioned, Deidara allowed himself to be led to a seat in front of a large mirror. He straightened his back so a dark cape could be settled round his neck before slumping back down into his usual posture. Then his chair was turned so the man from the desk could run fingers through his hair, no expression on his face but with a contemplative look in his eye. Deidara waited in silence, feeling almost as if he were auditioning for something. After a while the silence started to get to him. He had always hated long bouts without talking. "So," he said awkwardly, "I guess you would be the friend Kasame has here then." "Obviously. You got a name?" Fingers paused in the act of running through his damp locks and the man's dark eyes fixed on his, making him gulp. "Itachi," the man said. Deidara nodded. Itachi held his head still so that he could continue deliberating over the hair he was going to cut. Deidara was a little relieved when his chair was spun about again so that he faced the mirror. Those eyes were super intense and he felt strict bare under their gaze. His hands came out from under his cape to fiddle with each other as he watched his hair being inspected from yet another angle. It went on for several more minutes before he grew frustrated. "You just doing a trim, UN? What's the big deal? Is there something wrong with my hair?" Anyone who claimed he was pouting would receive a very loud rebuttal and a punch to the face. He did have to stop himself from crossing his arms there. Itachi met his eyes in the mirror and hesitated from the briefest of moments before replying. "No, it's fine." Deidara could almost have believed him, almost if he hadn't flinched at the sudden burn on the back of his right hand. He looked down to see the three words which had just been spoken to him standing out against his skin in stark black letters. Both men stared at the writing as it slowly faded away. They met each other's gaze again, stunned, and silence ruled at first. "You lied." Deidara burst out. "You said my hair was fine, but you lied." "What's wrong with my hair, eh?" One dark eyebrow rose up as Itachi bluntly told him, "It's shapeless. I could so much more with it. Something that would better suit your face. I don't like high-maintenance stuff, so nothing fancy, you hear?" He'd always liked his hair. It was a nice color and naturally soft and silky, but that didn't mean he liked spending the time to actually do anything with it. Itachi nodded. "Trust me," he said. Deidara looked down at his hand, at the spot where the words had appeared, and mumbled a quiet, "Yeah." He let Itachi work without paying much attention, his mind on other things. Things like the fact that he had just found his soulmate working at Uchiha Fat Cuts, of all places. He managed to zone out entirely as scissors snipped away a few inches, a blow-dry a word next to his ear, and fingers tabbed a layer up and away, sculpting and shaping. At long last a hand squeezed his shoulder to get his attention. When he looked up he had to blink to check and see if it was really Hen. Most of his hair had been left down, falling only a few inches past his shoulders now. Some of it had been pulled up into a high ponytail that fell wide and covered the back of his head. He also had a large section of fringe hanging down one side of his face that, if he tilted just right, he could use to hide one eye in a mysterious cool guy way. As he admired the style and how low effort it would be to maintain, a thin blue headband slid down over the top of his head. He blinked and looked over his shoulder at Itachi. "To match your eyes," Itachi explained. Deidara blinked at him. "Well," he demanded. "What do you think? Her look fine now?" He waited while the other man gave him a deliberate once-over. "Nope. I think you look awful." Itachi, it appeared, was the master of deadpan. Deidara had less than a second to bristle before his left arm flared up with a sudden burn. He freed more of his limb from the protective cape to reveal words scrawled on his skin just above his elbow. They said, "I think you look awful," in dark letters, giving him just enough time to grin before fading away. The grin was still in place when he ripped the cape off of his own neck and leapt from the chair. "Yeah, I think you look awful too," he crowed. Itachi made a tiny little jump and pressed a hand against his hip, but he wasn't able to look. He was a bit busy with an armful of Deidara, enthusiastic kisses raining across his face. Chapter 30, Shino Tenten, the one where you know them by touch. Tenten smirked as she watched her teammate gasp for air. Netta liked to think he was so much better than everyone else. She always enjoyed those moments when his stamina gave out before hers. Times like now when they had spent the last 2 hours fleeing from other teams in the forest of death. She'd heard that the Chin exams could be tough, but she never thought that they would have to survive 5 days on their own in here. Lee's ridiculous unitard came in handy for once as it blended in perfectly with the leaves, providing them with cover, making him almost the perfect lookout. Almost, because she was painfully aware of his habit of announcing everything at the top of his voice. Tenten loved her 2 boys, but there were days when she begged the gods to tell her why she had been teamed up with such weirdos. "I believe that the coast is clear," Lee announced, turning to her with a brilliant smile and an enthusiastic thumbs up. She nodded once. "Good." For a while there it was touch and go. Just because they say that deaths can happen doesn't mean we should all be trying to kill each other. That's not the point of this exam. She huffed while sliding her back down the trunk of the tree. Finally able to draw breath without wheezing, Neji alighted in front of her on the branch. As he brushed lint from his clothes he muttered, "Not everyone is concerned with what is polite, Tenten." The light sneer in his voice made her roll her eyes. "Whatever," she said. "I'm just glad we have a moment to ourselves." The other 2 were still nodding when a quiet voice just above her head said, "Not quite." Tenten leapt away from the trunk with a shriek, landing beside Ninja while Lee dashed over to stand in front of them and drop into a defensive stance. They looked up to see a team of 3 other genin all huddled on thinner branches only a few feet up. She recognized them as being part of the Ricky 9 that had been nominated for the exams even though they had only been genin a few months. One of them was a girl related somehow to Neja. One of them was a loud boy from the Inazuka clan. The third was the one who had spoken, a young boy from the Aburame clan, his face hidden behind sunglasses and a high collar. "Hinata, what do you think you're doing?" Netta sounded personally insulted by his relative's presence, as if she had done something wrong simply by being there. The girl above them stuttered and dapped her head. "Leave her alone," the Inazuka growled. "We were here first. We are hiding as well." "Why?" "It's because there are many teams who are trying." The Aburame was cut off when the Inazuka jumped in again. "There's teams out there just trying to kill everyone. Even teams that don't need our scroll." The loud boy didn't react at all when a small white puppy poked its head out from inside his jacket, although Tenten started a bit in surprise at the teeny bark it gave. Lee rose from his defensive stance and gave the 3 other genin a thumbs up as he said, "Then we are happy to share our tree with you. After all, us ninja of the leaf must stick together." "Lee, don't be an idiot." Ninja crossed his arms as he spoke. "This is a competition. Cooperating with them has no benefit for us. Ten rolled her eyes. It also does us no harm. We are all just trying to survive right now. She waved the three others down. Just ignore him, come join us. The girl whom Nita had called her Nada looked like she might fade, but the other two leapt down right away. Lee and Ten greeted them all while Nita huffed and activated his Byakugan, looking off into the surrounding forest to check for enemies. It turned out that their groups had the same scroll, meaning there was really no reason to attack each other, so the two teams lounged about together while hiding from potential enemies. Ten had been trying to bring the Hyuga girl out of her shell for 10 minutes when it happened. They had been sitting close to the Abdurrahim boy, who had only added a few comments to the conversation. He seemed well-spoken and thoughtful, although his teammates had a tendency of cutting him off. As she leaned forward, Ten's hand had slipped on the bark of the tree. She lost her balance and, with a shriek, toppled headlong into midair. She was extending her arms to try and catch herself on a branch when her fall came to an abrupt halt before it ever really got started. That wasn't the strange part though. The strange part was the fact that warmth was suddenly spreading throughout her body in waves, rippling out from the hand wrapped around her ankle. She knew with absolutely certainty, without even needing to look, that Abdurrahim Shino was the one that had caught her. Which was odd because she couldn't remember anyone introducing her to him for her to know that his given name was Shino. Dangling upside down, she tucked her chin in to look up and see that he was staring down at her, motionless, arm extended to hold her weight. "Well, what are you waiting for?" the Inuzuka boy demanded. "Pull her back up." Leaves and twigs brushed her face as she found herself moving in reverse, back up to where she had been sitting before. Extra pairs of hands helped lift her up and she found herself face to face with the one who had caught her. She couldn't see through the glasses, but she could see the color slowly creeping its way up his cheeks. "Hi," she breathed, feeling just a little swept away. She wouldn't have expected to find her soulmate here, of all places, in the forest of death. She had a vague thought that she hoped the fall hadn't messed up her hair. "Hello," Shino replied. No other words were needed, really. She smiled at him, ignoring for the moment the worried fluttering of the other four genin. Guy-sensei liked to go on about the springtime of youth and the magic of love, telling her that she would understand what he meant one day when it happened to her. Well, here it was. It was happening now. And as Shino slowly lowered his sunglasses and a shy smile peeked out above the collar of his jacket, she thought that she definitely understood. Chapter 31, Fugaku or Hayasha, the one where words on your own show on your soulmates. Sunset painted the room incredible colors through the open window. With the curtains pulled back, his walls were lit up with lines of fire and glowing embers, fitting decoration for the head of the Uchiha clan. Fugaku, however, was not paying attention to the splendor of the fall evening that was gracing him with its beauty. His attention was instead on his arm. The sleeve of his yukata was pulled back to bare the pale skin underneath, where black letters were crawling down from his elbow towards his wrist. The letters were written in the graceful hand of his soulmate, asking him a question of no real import. It was not a message that would benefit the clan or help with a mission. Yet Fugaku cherished the words anyway, as he cherished every word his soulmate had ever seen fit to write to him. When the message faded away, he took up his brush and dipped it in a new bipod of ink. Light strokes decorated his arm with dark words of his own, a slightly whimsical reply to the question asked. He allowed the ink to sit for a moment, giving the intended recipient time to read it, before taking up a new towel to wipe clean the evidence of their communication. The towel was then folded so that the stains were hidden and placed back on the corner of his desk. He quickly drew his sleeve down as the door opened and his wife entered the room, carrying a tea service. She said nothing as she set it down and prepared a cup of chai for him. He nodded his thanks to her and gestured for her to remove the tray. When she moved to do as he wished, he saw her eyes catch on the folded towel. Too late he realized that he had put it back facing the wrong way, a damning mistake in a clan of people who trained to notice every small detail. Mikoto met his eyes with a blank expression, and for a moment in time they shared a silence filled with many unsaid things. Just as he thought he could take it no more, Mikoto turned and swept out of the room, knuckles wide around the tray that she carried. Fugaku sighed as the door closed with a snap and rubbed at his temples. He knew when he married her that no words had ever appeared on Mikoto's skin. A light tickling sensation prompted him to push his sleeve back up to see more writing, a humorous rebuttal to his whimsical answer. As the head of the clan, it was his duty to marry a proper wife and produce proper heirs. The life he lived was structured and rigid. But Fugako was smart enough to find the small bits of freedom. The clan could make him marry and the clan could keep him busy. But the clan could not take the love from his heart or the words from his arm. He reached for his ink. Across the village, in another compound, Hayasha watched thin brushstrokes paint words across his arm. I wish I could taste the laughter upon your lips. Chapter 32, Kakashi Hana, the one where you share a trait with your soulmate. It was incredibly obvious to Kakashi from a very young age that his soulmate must be from the Inuzuka clan. Once he realized that most people couldn't smell things the way he did or hear as well as he could, he quickly determined that this must be the skill he had been gained through his soulmate bond. Everyone had some trait or talent from their soulmate. His appeared to be heightened senses, and the only clan he knew of that had that trait was the Inuzuka. This posed a problem for Kakashi because there were tons of Inuzuka. He'd had 4 in his class during the 1 year he spent at the academy, and none of them had been siblings. It was one of the largest clans in Konoha, and it might take him a while to figure out who it was. Especially because it was impossible to tell what trait he might have given to his soulmate. The matter was even further complicated by the fact that some bond traits didn't manifest for years. His neighbor had only found his soulmate at 27 when he had suddenly started walking different at the same time that one of his friends received an injury which left them with a permanent limp. Soul traits were complex. By the time Kakashi was 13 years old, he had seen more battlefields than many people twice his age, and he had long since stopped wondering about his soulmate. Life had already thrown its fair share of hardships at him. He had a dead father, a dead teammate, and an eye that wasn't his. He spent most of his days caught between being paralyzed into uselessness with guilt and being motivated to try and live the life that had been taken from Obada. He really had no time to think about it. Today was a guilt day. Kakashi had already been at the memorial stone for 3 hours by the time Rin found him. The somber set of her mouth was a silent rebuke that made him look away, back down to his lap where his hands fiddled with a set of orange goggles. Obada wouldn't want you to beat yourself up like this, Rin said softly. He was good like that. Kakashi nodded his head, pretending he hadn't heard the catch in her voice. When she put a hand on his shoulder, he replaced the goggles to where he had taken them from on top of the memorial stone. Then he stood up and allowed Rin to lead him away, neither of them putting forth much effort to speak to each other. He had promised to protect her, and he did try hard to do so, but Obada's death had broken them apart just as much as it had brought them together. Rin's crush on him had faded, for which he was grateful, but now when they were together there were long silences where they both heard the echo of a missing voice. Unable to stand the silence today, Kakashi asked quietly, "Where are we going?" "To the Inuzuka compound," Rin said. "One of my friends has been at home sick for the last few weeks. I wanted to wish her well, and I thought you might like to play with the dogs." Kakashi blinked at her. It wasn't really a surprise that she had thought of it. Rin was a very thoughtful person after all. It continued to surprise him, though, when people did nice things for him. Even Rin, who would never leave a friend behind. The Inuzuka compound was as overrun with bodies as it usually was. People of every age, shinobi and civilian, moved every which way towards all sorts of tasks. Following at the heels of most of them were dogs of every size, color, and breed. Despite how down he was feeling, Kakashi was hard-pressed to stop himself from trying to pet every single dog. Rin was fully aware of his weakness for canines and was obviously exploiting that fact to cheer him up. Tricky girl. He supposed he should do something nice for her to say thank you for putting up with him so well lately. With the promise of visiting the newborn litters after a quick visit, Kakashi docilely followed his teammate to a house on the eastern outskirts of the compound. It was the house of the current clan head, if he remembered correctly. This was confirmed when a heavily pregnant Sume opened the door, greeting Rin with a wide toothy smile. When she caught sight of Kakashi, however, her face froze. Kakashi was used to all sorts of negative reactions to his presence. He'd been the subject of heckling and scorn since that one fateful mission of his father's, but this didn't seem to be quite the same thing. Sume looked as if he had shocked her, staring at him in silence, then she looked dumbfounded for a single heartbeat before a huge smile broke out on her face. Well, she said in a rough voice. "Hate Kakashi, ha? Come on in. You guys are here to see Hana, right?" She's upstairs in her room. With no further explanation for why she was acting so strangely, Soom waved the two of them into the house, pointing them towards the stairs to the upper floor. Kakashi frowned at her as he passed, getting nothing in return but a pleased grin. The hallway up the stairs was decorated with pictures documenting the growth of a girl about his age. New frames had been hung but remained empty, and he supposed they would soon be filled with pictures of the coming baby. Assuming the girl in the pictures was the one they were here to visit, Kakashi noted that he had met her before. He had helped out her genin team once when they had just barely graduated from the academy. He remembered her being polite but firm in dealing with her teammates, and she had been the only one of three who hadn't sneered at him for being an overachiever. Rin walked ahead of him and turned into a bedroom about halfway down the hall. He followed her in to see pale blue walls, a messy desk with two dogs napping underneath it, and the girl he had seen in the pictures huddled on a futon in the corner. Rin hurried over to sit next to her friend. "Hey Hannah, how are you feeling?" she asked. "I heard you were sick, so we came to cheer you up." The girl looked up from the book she'd been holding, squinting at them with one eye shut and looking as if she might fall over at any moment. "Is that Rin? You didn't have to come all this way." She accepted a short hug despite her protests before continuing, "I'm not really sick. We think the trait from my soulmate has just manifested and it's taking a bit of getting used to. I'm so dizzy." Hannah put a hand to her head as she swayed a little from side to side. Rin stared at her with a hand on her shoulder. Feeling awkward, Kakashi moseyed over to where the dogs were sprawled on top of a one-dog bed. One raised its head at his approach and began to wag its tail. He settled on the floor and began to pet the dog, barely listening as the two girls continued talking. "But that's good that you can tell what it is," Rin was saying. "So many people go their whole lives not knowing if something they're good at could simply be their born trait. I wish I knew. You're so lucky." "I'll feel luckier when I can keep both of my ears open without wanting to vomit," Hannah replied ruefully. They both chuckled and Rin patted her back. Then she poked up and said, "You should talk to Kakashi about that. He knows what that's like, don't you, Kakashi? He's going through something really similar." Hannah tilted her head and regarded Kakashi curiously with the one eye she was holding open. Kakashi looked up from petting the dogs to give his teammate a disapproving scowl and grumbled, "That's private." She scowled right back and shook a finger at him. "Don't be like that," she reprimanded him. "Your comrade needs help and it won't kill you to talk to someone other than me and Sensei." Their brief staring content ended with Kakashi huffing and turning his head away, glaring down at the two dogs still contentedly wagging their tails. He didn't want to talk to anyone about Obito's eye. Part of him didn't want to tell anyone about the lowest point of his entire young life, when he had let down his comrades and gotten his friend killed. Another part of him wanted to keep what memories he did have to himself, as if telling people about Obito would somehow cheapen those memories. Still, Rin was scary when she wanted something, especially if she thought that something would be good for him. "Fine," he said quietly without turning back. It would be easier to talk if he didn't have to look at anyone, or more importantly, see how they looked at him. "Is that why you have one eye covered? Because you get dizzy if you open it?" Hannah sounded relieved to hear someone else was experiencing the same thing. Kakashi shut her down right away. "The circumstances are different. My eye is special and it's difficult to use." He didn't count on the stubborn spirit of the Inuzuka clan. "But you do get dizzy?" Hannah asked, ignoring his not very subtle fuck-off vibes. "Does it make you nauseous?" "I get really nauseous sometimes, and sometimes it's worse than others. It seems to be connected to how much chakra I'm using, so I've been staying home and trying not to use any chakra." Kakashi sighed and he reluctantly went on, "The nausea is psychosomatic for me. I mostly get headaches, and if I overuse it then I experience chakra exhaustion twice as fast as I used to." He could almost feel Ren's eyes boring into the back of his head. She was a great medic in training, and any time he even alluded to the state of his health her attention was razor sharp. Luckily, he wasn't saying anything she didn't already know. "Huh. I guess it's not the same then," Hannah said. "Does yours look funny though?" At that, Kakashi actually turned his head to raise his eyebrow at her. "What do you mean by look funny?" "Well, when I open my left eye everything looks sort of red and I see things like they're moving in slow motion." She paused to think. "No, not slow motion. It would be more accurate to say that I see things faster than they are actually happening. It would be great for training if I could stop feeling so sick all the time and actually use it. Kakashi was staring at her, his hidden mouth gaping wide open. As his silence stretched, both of the girls gave him slightly worried looks. Tsune's dumbfounded face came to mind, and he had a sneaking suspicion what she might have just realized upon seeing him. Finally he cleared his throat and tried to speak, tension keeping his body perfectly still. You said it looks red. Do you mean everything is that color, or it is more like you're seeing normal colors through red-tinted glass? He watched Hana very closely while she tilted her head to one side. The second one, she said. He swallowed. Do you find yourself noticing even more detail with that eye open? Hana frowned, surprised. Yeah, actually. Now that you mention it, I do see a lot more detail in things that I probably didn't notice before. Oh, Kakashi breathed. It came out embarrassingly high-pitched, catching the attention of both Hana and Ren. They both raised their eyebrows and gave him questioning looks. It took him a minute and clearing his throat a second time before he could say, sounds a lot like you're using a Sharingan. And your body is just adjusting to it. With the look that Ren gave him, he could tell she understood what he meant right away. She looked stunned for a brief moment before cracking a wide smile and throwing both hands in the air, crowing triumphantly, yes. That's amazing. Hana, on the other hand, was looking between the both of them and demanding an explanation. She didn't seem to pick up on the significance of only experiencing Sharingan vision out of one eye. Perhaps she hadn't heard the story yet. Kakashi did spend a lot of time trying to keep the rumors quiet. It was a bigger battle advantage if no one saw it coming. Rin. Hana protested when the other girl threw her arms around her. What on earth is so exciting about this? Kakashi took a steadying breath as his teammate answered. Because. Oh. Rin let out a squeal before finally the words came pouring out. It means that you and Kakashi are soulmates. You started to get sick around the same time that Kakashi got the Sharingan. And it's the same eye. My friends are soulmates, I'm so happy. Hana whipped her head about to stare at Kakashi, who stared back helplessly. Rin kicked her feet in joy before leaping off the futon to go find Tsune and confirm the good news. Alone, the newly matched soulmates continued to stare at each other in silence. Kakashi had no idea what to say. He'd always known he was matched to an Inuzuka, of course, but it had been so many years since he had stopped even wondering who they were. He hadn't felt like he was at a point in his life where he should be searching for them. Now here she was, and he was startled by how relieved he felt, how peaceful. As if a weight had lifted off his shoulders. He was amazed to realize how much he wanted to drop his head into her lap and let her run her fingers through his hair. So, her voice made him jump. What trait did you get from me, then, she asked. Enhanced senses, he replied simply. She nodded. All of them all. Just hearing and smell. Useful there. She nodded again and they fell silent. Downstairs, the bark of Tsune's laughter was mixing and with Ren's garbled excited words. The dogs were shifting around on their bedding, tails wetting so hard they were slapping against the leads of the desk. Hana slipped off the bedding to come sit next to him, reaching out a hand for her dogs to nuzzle happily against. She squeaked when Kakashi leaned into her, burying his face in her neck and wrapping his arms around her as tightly as he dared. To be honest, it startled him just as much as her. He hadn't meant to do it, he'd just moved on instinct. Just when he went to pull away, however, she lifted her arms to hug him back. She smiled when he melted into her embrace. Thank you, he whispered. He felt Hana turn her head to look at the top of his as she said, what for? For existing. He couldn't explain it right now. He hadn't realized just how much he needed her until suddenly there she was. He wouldn't have thought so, but he was glad to find her now. A small hand patted the back of his head, stroking his hair as he'd been imagining her doing. She didn't say anything in reply because she didn't have time. Rin and Tsune appeared in the doorway and resumed squealing about how cute a picture they made all huddled together on the floor. As they separated, however, they caught each other's eye. When he saw the expression on Hana's face, he knew. She was happy to have him too.